Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Bedtime Black Files, where life's most powerful lessons are revealed through unforgettable true crime events from around the world. If you're stepping into our community for the first time, I'm truly glad you're here. Thank you for joining us. Before we get into it, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Consider hitting the subscribe button. Don't forget to like and share this video with someone who needs it. Your support helps our family grow, connect, and keep these powerful stories alive. Now let's dive in. Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat disappeared after a night in Prahecq, France, in November 2022. What began as a missing person case slowly turned into one of the country's most disturbing double murder investigations, shaped by familiar faces, conflicting accounts, hidden movements, and months of painful uncertainty. If a person stops answering a phone for a few hours, most people call it a delay. If two young adults stop answering at the same time, leave work, plans, family, a dog, personal papers, and two separate vehicles behind, it becomes something else. It becomes the kind of silence that forces everyone around it to decide what they believe first: accident, choice, or violence. On the night of November 25th, 2022, Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat were part of an ordinary social plan in western France. There was no public sign that the evening would become one of the most watched criminal cases in the country. No public warning, no announced threat, no final message that clearly said they were in danger. There was only a small town chain of familiar names, a place to sleep, a late hour, and a gap that would soon begin swallowing every easy explanation. Before we go any further, pause for a second and tell me this in the comments. When someone you care about suddenly goes silent, what is the first thing your mind does? Make excuses for them or fear the worst? Cases like this matter because the answer to that question often decides how quickly people act. France did not first see this case as a murder case. France first met it as a disappearance. That distinction matters because disappearance leaves room for denial. Families can still hope. Friends can still explain away the missing hours. Police can still test softer possibilities. But in this case, the public story changed in stages, and each stage removed one more safe explanation until only brutality remained. Leslie Hoorelbeke was 22 years old. Kévin Trompat was 21. Public reporting described them as a very recent couple, together for less than a month when they vanished. That detail is important, not because it made them careless, but because it placed them at the fragile opening of a relationship, the stage where plans are still forming, where people are still learning one another's routines, where families are still taking the measure of the new person beside their son or daughter. It also meant that later public theories about jealousy, emotional grievance, debt, and divided loyalties would fall into a relationship that had barely had time to become established. What has been publicly documented about Leslie's life is modest, but it is enough to show that she did not appear to be preparing to disappear on purpose. Reports described her as active, independent, and working in the building trades. Some accounts referred to painting and decorating work, while others described her as running a small business connected to construction. However the label was written, the core fact was the same. Leslie had real obligations, real jobs, real continuity. She was not floating without attachment. She was in contact with family, known to them as someone who answered, someone whose absence would be noticed quickly. Kévin's public portrait is also drawn from fragments, yet those fragments point in the same direction. He had plans. He had recently bought a converted van, Some reports described him as moving toward market gardening, others simply as a young man still building his place in adult life. Like Leslie, he was rooted enough that his silence struck relatives as wrong, almost at once. The missing were not two people drifting away from everyone around them. They were two people still inside the rhythm of ordinary life. That is why families often become the first real fact-checkers in a case like this. Before phone records are mapped, before judges enter the story, before national broadcasters build timelines, relatives test the simplest claim of all. Would this person leave without warning? In Leslie and Kévin's case, the answer from those who knew them was clear. No, their families did not treat the silence as normal, and that refusal would matter. It kept pressure on the case during the phase when public certainty did not yet exist. The uploaded background file tells the same story. The disappearance made no sense inside the daily structure of their lives, and family members moved quickly to challenge any idea that they had simply chosen to go away. There was another detail that gave the case a strange emotional weight. Leslie's dog, Onyx, was also missing. People sometimes overlook what details like that do to public perception. Missing phone can be switched off. A missing adult can be explained away for a time. A missing dog, attached to the same timeline, changes the emotional shape of the story. It makes departure without contact feel less believable to many people, because everyday life becomes harder to reconstruct in an innocent way. Onyx would remain one of the case's unresolved threads, a small but painful symbol of everything that vanished that night. To understand why the case struck France so deeply, you have to understand where it began. Not in a dark alley, not in an unknown place. It began inside a network of familiar people in and around Prahecq, near Niort, in the Deux-Sèvres. That setting shaped the case from the start. This was not a story first presented to the public as stranger danger. It was a story built from ordinary local trust, friends, shared plans, known houses, known roads, a place to sleep after a night out. Cases tied to everyday familiarity often frighten the public more than random attacks, because they break a comforting belief that danger usually arrives from outside the circle. The known outline of the last evening has remained broadly stable in public reporting. On November 2005, 2022, Leslie and Kévin went to Prahecq. They were expected to spend time with a friend named Nicholas, and the plan was that they would later sleep at a house belonging to Tom Trylot. Before the evening was over, some of their belongings, along with Onyx, had been left at that house. They were seen during the evening. They later spent time with friends. Reports place their departure from Nicholas's place around 3 in the morning. After that point, there is no confirmed public sighting of them alive that settled the matter cleanly. Listen carefully to how ordinary that sounds. It is exactly why the first stage of the case felt so hard to read. Nothing in that plan, on its face, looked extraordinary. No declared crisis, no dramatic public argument, no announced disappearance from a station or airport. Just a sequence countless young adults could have lived through without consequence. Spend an evening out, head toward a known place, sleep there, pick up the next day where life left off. But the most important early lesson in cases like this is simple, ordinary plans can hide extraordinary risk when the wrong people control the final location. That is why this case is not only about criminal violence. It is also about the fatal power of ordinary trust. A known door can feel safer than an unknown road. A friendly invitation can feel safer than a warning. In cases like this, that false comfort can cost everything in one night. That house matters. Tom Trulay's role matters. The place where Leslie and Kévin were expected to sleep matters. At first, it entered the story as a practical detail. Later, it would sit near the center of the case. Public reporting would describe contradictions around Tom's account of the night, including questions about where he really was when he returned, and what digital traces showed about contact during the final known hours. Those contradictions did not answer every question, but they cracked open the safe version of events. That shift is one reason this case held public attention so forcefully. Early public appearances can mislead. A person can stand near a search operation, speak to the press, sound composed, and still later move much closer to the center of a homicide inquiry. In this case, that pattern would become one of the most unsettling features of the whole affair. The possibility that those nearest to the explanation were also nearest to the crime. Before the law could say murder, the facts had to say something was wrong. By the first days of December 2022, relatives were already sounding the alarm. Leslie and Kévin were not answering. The silence was no longer a delay. It was a break from character. Authorities opened an inquiry into a worrying disappearance. Search efforts began building around the people, places, and technical traces tied to their last known movements. Publicly, police did not rush to name one theory. That caution is normal at the start of a live case. Yet, even without a declared criminal label, the tone had shifted. This was not being treated like two carefree adults extending a night out. Families did what families often do when the official process feels too slow for fear. They searched, organized, spoke publicly, and pushed. The file you attached describes how the families worked to rebuild the final movements, review leads, and resist the idea of a voluntary disappearance. That pressure matters in long-form true crime because it tells us who carried the case emotionally before the wider public caught up. It was not television first. It was family insistence first. Soon, the physical details began undermining every easy theory. The phones did not behave normally. Public reporting later placed Leslie's phone in Niort around midday on 26 November and Kévin's in Forays on 29 November. Their vehicles also complicated the scene. Leslie's vehicle remained near the place in Prahecq, where the couple was expected to stay. Kévin's van was found elsewhere, in Coulon, when two people vanish together, but their movements, devices and transport do not form one coherent line. Investigators start asking a harder question. Did someone else continue the story after the victims could no longer speak for themselves? That question became harder still on December 8, 2022, when belongings linked to the couple were discovered in a clothing collection container in Hoorelbeke in Charente-Maritime. Identity documents and personal effects do not usually throw themselves away across departmental lines. That discovery widened the map and sharpened the case. A voluntary departure now looked weaker. Disposal looked stronger. The movement looked deliberate. Someone, it seemed, had not only removed Leslie and Kévin from sight, but also started managing what they left behind. At that point, the case entered a painful middle ground familiar to many families in missing person files. Hope still exists, but hope is losing ground to pattern. Each new fact does not yet prove death, yet each one makes ordinary survival harder to defend. This is one reason disappearance cases grip audiences so deeply. The story keeps asking one brutal question without answering it. How long can hope remain honest once the evidence begins turning against it? If this case already has you thinking about how quickly trust can collapse inside a familiar circle, press like now and subscribe to Bedtime Black Files stories. Cases like this are not only about what happened, they're about what people missed, what families noticed first, and what lessons can still protect someone listening tonight. For 3 months, the answer stayed buried. The public saw searches, pleas, leads, and fragments. But beneath that surface, investigators were building a different account, one that moved away from disappearance and toward planned violence carried out by people already known to the victims. That is where this story truly begins. In the background, the people closest to Leslie and Kévin were already living a different version of time. Public time is measured in headlines and updates. Family time is measured in unanswered calls, unchanged voicemail greetings, half-finished plans, and the fixed stares people develop when they are replaying the last normal conversation over and over. Leslie's father, Patrick Hoorelbeke, and her stepmother, Emily Cadre, became highly visible in the search. Kevin's father, Guy Trompat, and his stepmother, Corinne Pratt, also entered the public effort. Their names matter, because this case did not stay inside court files. It unfolded in front of relatives who refused to let silence harden into neglect. In this case, that meant public appeals, volunteer searches, and a continuing insistence that Leslie and Kévin had not simply chosen to disappear. It also meant living through one of the hardest conditions a family can face, knowing that something is wrong without yet being able to prove how wrong. Months passed before the public saw the case break open. That delay can make people think nothing was happening. In fact, the opposite is usually true. During the long, quiet phase, investigators were comparing statements, studying phone activity, tracking movements, testing alibis, and watching for inconsistency. Public sources later described changes in behavior, contradictions in schedules, shifting accounts of location, and a strange distance in the conduct of some people around the case. None of that alone proves homicide. Together, those details begin changing what police look for and who they look at. Late February and early March 2023 became the turning point. Investigators arrested Tom Trulay first, the same friend whose house had been part of the final known plan. He was placed under formal investigation for kidnapping and unlawful confinement. Soon after, other men were taken into custody, including Nathan B. and Enzo C. What had begun publicly as a disappearance was now openly moving into the territory of violent crime. The change was dramatic, but it did not come from nowhere. It came from months of pressure, technical work, and the slow collapse of earlier explanations. The hardest confirmation arrived on March 3rd, 2023, guided by information gathered during custody. Investigators found 2 bodies in Charente-Maritime. Kevin's body was found first in Prahecq. Leslie was found the next day in a wooded area near Versen, about 5 kilometers away. The prosecutor later confirmed the bodies were those of Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat. Public reporting stated that both were found clothed, that autopsies indicated they had probably died from blows inflicted with a blunt object, and that there were no signs of sexual assault on. Leslie hope did not fade at that point. It was ended by evidence. That discovery changed the moral center of the case. France was no longer asking where two young adults had gone. France was asking who had trapped them, who had struck them, who had moved them, and why. It was also asking a second question that never leaves cases like this. How many warning signs only make sense after the dead can no longer explain them? That is the question we carry into the next part, because once the bodies were found, the story did not become simpler. It became more crowded, more disputed, and more disturbing. What looked local, brief and manageable, was becoming a case that would test memory, loyalty, patience, and justice itself. The circle around Leslie and Kévin did not open neatly. It tightened. What makes cases like this so hard to accept is not only the violence that comes later, it is the normal life that came before it. Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat were not introduced to the public as people standing on the edge of catastrophe. They were introduced as two young adults with work, family, plans, recent affection, and a social circle that looked familiar enough to pass without alarm. That is where the danger lived in this case, inside what already felt known. Leslie was 22. Public reporting described her as active, hard-working, and already building something for herself. The strongest open-source portrait available is not a full biography, and honesty matters here. There is no reliable public record laying out her whole childhood, her schooling in detail, or a complete relationship history. What does emerge, however, is a young woman who was not disconnected from life. She was described as economically active and self-directed, working in building, painting, and plasterboard installation, with coverage pointing to a small business of her own. That matters, because it places her in motion. She had commitments. She had clients or work sites. She had practical reasons to remain reachable. A person can disappear into crime without leaving behind a glamorous life. Ordinary responsibility is enough to prove that sudden silence is wrong. Kévin's public portrait is similarly incomplete, yet it carries the same basic message. He was about 21 when he vanished. Some reports tie him to the Marais Poitevin area and to a change of life that seemed connected to rural living. Other accounts describe future plans, work possibilities, and a recently purchased converted van. Like Leslie, he does not appear in the public record as someone preparing to vanish by choice. He appears as a young man still building an adult life, still linked to family, still surrounded by routines that made disappearance look false almost as soon as it happened. The relationship between Leslie and Kévin was also new. Public reporting repeatedly notes that they had been together for less than a month when they disappeared. That single fact changes how the whole case feels. A long marriage carries years of known tension. A very recent couple carries uncertainty of another kind. There is less shared history, fewer stable expectations, and more room for outside people to misread, resent, manipulate, or interfere. It also means that affection can still be raw, hopeful, and exposed. When the public later heard theories involving jealousy, grievance, money, and emotional disappointment, that short relationship suddenly felt tragically vulnerable. It had barely begun. This is where the human lesson in the case starts taking shape. A relationship does not need years behind it to attract envy. A social setting does not need open conflict to hide danger. A friend group does not need to look chaotic from the outside to contain one person nursing resentment, one person covering for someone else, or one house waiting like a closed trap. Have you ever looked back at a group around you and realized everybody was not reading the same situation at all? One person thinks the evening is casual. Another thinks it is emotional. Another thinks money is involved. Another is already calculating risk. Tell me in the comments, do you believe most betrayal comes with warning signs, or do people only notice them after the damage is done? The case file you gave me makes another point that is easy to miss if we only focus on the crime. Public biographies of Leslie and Kévin are fragmentary for a reason. They were not celebrities. They were young adults whose names became national only because something terrible happened to them. That is one reason the case hit people so hard. Many viewers can see themselves in lives like these more easily than in cases built around wealth, fame, or power. Work, family, new love, a late social plan, known address. Those are the materials of ordinary life. This crime grew out of ordinary life and broke it from inside. Leslie's family bond appears strongly in the reporting. Her father, Patrick Hoorelbeke, and her stepmother, Emily Cardre, entered the public record quickly because they refused passivity. Their closeness to Leslie is not just a detail for sympathy. It tells us something about her daily world. She was not socially unmoored. She was connected enough that her absence triggered immediate, instinctive alarm. Kevin's family context carries the same force. His father, Guy Trompat, later became one of the most visible and volatile public figures around the case, which says something both about the depth of attachment and the scale of the devastation that followed. And still, for all that closeness, the last known plan did not look extraordinary. On the evening of November 2005, 2022, Leslie and Kévin went to Prahecq, near Njord. The broad public outline is stable enough to follow carefully. They were to spend part of the evening with Nicolas. Afterward, they were meant to sleep in a house belonging to Tom Trulette. Before the night was over, some of their belongings, along with Leslie's dog Onyx, had been left there. They were seen during the evening. Reports placed their disappearance window during the night of 25 to 26 November, with the last known frame narrowing toward the early hours of the 26th. That final arrangement matters more than any other early fact because it placed the couple inside a circle of ordinary trust. A friend's house is one of the last places most people would treat as a threat. It is not a roadside encounter. It is not a stranger's car. It is not the unknown. The word friend does heavy work in a criminal narrative. It lowers defenses. It fills gaps in planning. It makes people accept inconvenience. It also creates an emotional shield after the crime, because the public is slower to believe that someone near the search could also be near the violence. Tom Trulette entered the story through that shield. At first, he was known publicly as the friend whose house was part of the couple's overnight plan. Later, he moved much closer to the center of the criminal case. That movement is one of the reasons Part 2 must stay careful and factual. We cannot rewrite the record into certainty that did not exist on the night itself. Leslie and Kévin were not walking into a scene publicly known to them as dangerous. They were walking through a plan that looked socially normal. The terror lies there, not in obvious menace, in routine permission. Nicholas matters too, even if the public role attached to his name is smaller. His place sits inside the last social window before the couple vanished. Public accounts place Leslie and Kévin with him before they left around 3 in the morning. That means the final hours were not some blank cinematic mystery from the beginning. There were witnesses, hosts, known roads, ordinary transitions from one place to another. This is important for viewers because it corrects a common misunderstanding about violent crime. Many people think lethal events begin with dramatic rupture. In reality, many begin with continuity. A normal evening keeps moving until suddenly it no longer belongs to the people living it. Onyx, Leslie's dog, gives the timeline another emotional edge. The dog was part of the plan. The dog was left at the house. The dog also disappeared into the case and remained untraced in public reporting. That does not merely add sadness. It adds texture to the social scene. Leslie and Kévin were not moving like people preparing for a clean break from life. They were moving like people expecting to continue the next day. You do not set up an ordinary overnight arrangement with a dog in the middle of it if the next chapter is meant to be vanishing by choice. This is the point where many true crime stories go wrong on YouTube. They rush from names to blood, from missing persons to body discovery, without sitting long enough inside the vulnerable everyday logic that made the victims trust the setting. I do not want you to miss that lesson here, because it is one of the most useful parts of the case. Catastrophe often borrows the shape of convenience. Stay here tonight. You know the place? It's near. It's no problem. Those are not dramatic phrases. Yet, in the wrong hands, they can become the architecture of a trap. If this part is making you rethink how often danger can wear the face of familiarity, subscribe now and stay with me. Bedtime Black Files Stories is not here only to recount loss. It is here to turn real cases into warning signs people can still use. Public reporting later described the case as involving a proximate social network, friends, acquaintances, overlapping local ties, nights out, substance use allegations, and contested money issues. That phrasing matters because it pushes the case away from the fantasy of the unknown monster and toward a much harsher truth. The threat was close. The names were not random. The roads were familiar. The distances were short. The people were not far outside the victim's social reality. When viewers hear that a case may involve emotional grievance, drug-linked debt, or interpersonal tension, they sometimes imagine a loud, obvious environment full of visible warning signs. But many small-town or semi-rural cases do not present that way at all. They often look fragmented. One person knows about money, another knows about feelings, another knows about a vehicle, another knows a place to sleep. Another knows who is supposed to be where. No single person inside the group may hold the whole danger in clear form. That scattered knowledge is one reason violent group cases can be so hard to stop before they happen. The house in Prahecq therefore becomes more than a location. It becomes the physical point where several separate lines met. Leslie and Kevin's trust met Tom's access. The evening with Nicholas met the late night plan. Onyx and personal belongings were left there, which suggests anticipation of return and continuity. Later, investigators treated Prahecq as central to the crime narrative, including the theory that the fatal ambush began there. But even before later judicial reconstruction, the emotional meaning of the house was already fixed. It was the place the couple was supposed to be safe enough to sleep. That reversal is why this case kept such a grip on France. People can process the idea that strangers are dangerous. What unsettles them more deeply is the idea that shared space can be dangerous without changing its appearance first. A roadside house does not announce itself. A local acquaintance does not carry a warning label. Familiarity can become a disguise, not because it is fake in every respect, but because people keep using yesterday's version of someone long after that version has expired. There is another painful truth sitting here. Leslie and Kévin were young, but youth was not the cause of what happened to them. Trust was. Social closeness was. The ordinary human habit of assuming that a known circle is safer than an unknown one was. That does not blame them. It clarifies the mechanism. A planned meeting point works precisely because the victims do not need to be forced into it from the street. By the time families began to understand that something was deeply wrong, the friend circle was no longer just context. It was evidence waiting to be sorted. Every statement mattered. Every claimed location mattered. Every timeline gap mattered. The same names that made the evening feel stable would later make the case feel unbearable. Because once suspicion enters a friend network, every harmless detail from the last ordinary night becomes toxic in memory. Think about that for a moment. A shared conversation becomes a final conversation. A ride becomes a transfer point. A house key becomes access. A place to sleep becomes the place from which no safe morning came. There is also a structural lesson in how this case sits inside modern true crime. Audiences often search for dramatic abnormality as proof that danger was near. A public meltdown, a visible threat, a furious breakup, a documented assault. But the open record here does not begin with any of those clear theatrical markers. It begins with fragments that look manageable on their own. A recent couple, a social evening, friend's house, a dog left overnight, a normal route between familiar places. That is exactly why the case belongs in serious discussion. It forces viewers to face a harder reality. Some of the most destructive crimes do not begin with chaos. They begin with arrangements that feel efficient, familiar, and socially approved. For Leslie, that meant stepping into a night that still looked connected to work, family, and a new relationship. For Kévin, it meant moving through a setting where his presence would not have seemed out of place to anyone watching from outside. For Patrick, Emily, Guy, and Corinne, it would later mean revisiting these same harmless details until each one felt poisoned by hindsight. Every family that has ever lived through a disappearance understands this transformation. A memory is first ordinary, later unbearable, and finally evidentiary. You stop hearing it as a story and start hearing it as a clock. That is what the house in Prahecq became. Not merely a location on a map, but a clock, a place where the last believable version of safety kept ticking for Leslie and Kévin, even as the truth was moving against them. Once a case reaches that point, the moral pressure changes. The question is no longer whether the victims made a wrong choice. The question is who used ordinary trust as a weapon, and how long it took the outside world to understand that the danger was already inside the room. And that is why the friend circle cannot be treated as mere scenery in this story. It is the bridge between normal life and criminal accusation, the human corridor through which trust passed first and fear arrived too late. That is where part 2 has to leave us. Not at the bodies, not at the arrests, at the tightening circle. Leslie and Kévin did not disappear from a faceless world. They disappeared from inside a known one. The people, places, and routines around them were not background decoration. They were the structure of the case itself. Once that is understood, the next question becomes unavoidable. When silence finally started to harden into evidence, which facts broke the social mask first? At first, missing person cases are often built on hope. Families call, friends check one more address, phones are redialed. Someone says there must be an explanation. Someone else says they probably needed space. But there comes a moment in certain cases when silence stops behaving like absence and starts behaving like proof. In the Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat case, that moment did not arrive in one dramatic burst. It arrived piece by piece, each detail removing one innocent explanation after another. By the time December 2022 was underway, the question was no longer whether their silence was unusual. The question was what kind of event could silence two young adults at once, scatter their traces across different places, and leave everyone closest to them trying to force logic onto facts that refused to act like a normal disappearance. This phase of the case matters, because it shows how investigators and families learn to read absence. Leslie's father, Prahecq Hoorelbeke, said publicly that his daughter was independent, but she stayed in touch. If she left for a weekend, she told them. That statement sounds simple, yet it carried enormous weight. Families are the first people who know whether silence is ordinary or wrong. In this case, Leslie's relatives did not treat the missing hours as a casual lapse. They treated them as a break from character. And TF1's reporting from mid-December shows that this alarm was already firm by then. Kévin's relatives also moved away from the idea of a voluntary disappearance and began publicly raising the possibility of kidnapping and unlawful confinement. Those reactions did not prove a crime on their own, but they changed the emotional and investigative posture of the case. The timing was crucial. Leslie and Kévin were last publicly placed in Prahecq during the night of 25 to 26 November 2022, after an evening involving friends and a plan to sleep at a known house. Reports cited by TF1 say they left around 3 in the morning. That detail became one of the last stable facts in a case that would soon become full of contested movements and disputed roles. Once the couple moved beyond that point, normal continuity collapsed. There were no reassuring check-ins. No credible explanation was delivered the next day. No ordinary trail of activity, showing that they had simply changed plans and carried on with life. The silence began at the exact place where routine should have resumed. One of the earliest signs that investigators were dealing with something harder than an ordinary disappearance came from the phones. Leslie's phone, according to TF1 and other later reporting, registered near Niort on 26 November and then stopped. Kévin's phone would later be associated with a final signal days afterward in Prahecq, in Charente-Maritime, before it too ceased normal activity. Those two device trails did not form a clean story of voluntary travel together. They suggested discontinuity, possible movement after the couple disappeared, and a widening map that reached beyond Prahecq. When phones linked to two missing people stop at different times in different places, investigators are no longer dealing with simple silence. They are dealing with a trail that may have been continued by somebody else. That is one of the most useful lessons in this case. Silence by itself is frightening, but silent devices can still speak. A last signal, a final cell tower, a gap in banking activity, a sudden stop in messages, all of these become a language of interruption. According to La Dépêche, Leslie's bank accounts no longer recorded movements after 14 November, and her phone last registered on 26 November in Niort. Kévin's phone reportedly stopped emitting on 29 November in Prahecq. Even where a detail like banking activity may not answer the case by itself, it helps establish one thing very clearly: the daily pattern of life has been cut away. The vehicles pushed that point even harder. The public could have imagined, for a brief time, that Leslie and Kévin had walked away, hitched a ride, or made some abrupt personal decision. But the cars did not support that theory. Early reporting explained that Leslie's vehicle remained near the friend's house in Prahecq, where the couple had been expected to stay, while Kévin's converted van was found elsewhere, in Coulon, roughly 30 kilometers away. A pair who choose to leave together do not usually produce a trail that splits their transport in this way, while also leaving behind growing concern, a missing dog, and total silence toward family. The vehicles did not just fail to solve the story, they made the story stranger. Patrick Hoorelbeke's public comments capture the shock of that discovery. In RTL's account, he described the moment of realizing that Kévin's vehicle was still there as a jolt that broke the easy version of events. The couple, relatives reasoned, had not simply left with all their things. They had not sensibly walked off into winter, carrying multiple bags and a dog from a small commune outside Niort. That detail is easy for audiences to miss, but it matters deeply. Real cases are often cracked not by cinematic clues, but by common-sense objections raised by the people who know the geography and the habits of the missing. Here the ordinary logic of movement helped show that the public story being offered did not fit the physical reality. Searches followed. Appeals for witnesses were launched. Gendarmes heard from dozens of people in the missing pair's circle and searched several areas without immediate success, according to TF1. These were still the weeks when hope and dread lived side by side. Families organized, volunteers gathered, online groups spread information, and local attention stayed high. Cases like this are emotionally brutal because effort does not bring instant reward. Each search can deepen fear as easily as it can bring relief. Every field checked without result can start to feel like an accusation against hope itself. Yet the searches mattered. They kept pressure on the case. kept the names visible, and forced the public to confront the fact that two people with ongoing lives had dropped out of sight at the same time. The break that changed everything in this stage came on December 8th, 2022. That was the day belongings tied to the couple were found in a clothing recycling container in Prahecq, in Charente-Maritime. TF1 reported specifically that Kévin's driving license was among the items recovered. Other coverage described additional effects, clothing, shoes, Leslie's toiletry items, and other personal objects. This mattered for several reasons at once. First, the objects had been displaced well beyond the immediate disappearance zone. Second, they had not been discovered in a way that suggested orderly travel. Third, their presence in a recycling container introduced the likelihood of deliberate disposal. Missing people sometimes leave home. They do not usually scatter personal property into textile collection bins across departmental lines. Notice how the case map was changing. Prahecq was the place of the last known social plan. Niort was linked to Leslie's phone signal. Coulon became tied to Kévin's van. Poirevold entered through the discarded belongings. Forays emerged through the later activity associated with Kévin's phone. This was not the map of a couple starting a new life. It was the map of interruption, movement, and concealment, even before bodies were found. The geography itself was arguing against innocence. The wider the trail spread, the less believable a voluntary disappearance became. This is where the title of this part becomes real. Silence started feeling like evidence because it was no longer empty. It was surrounded by objects, distances, and dead ends. The missing pair were not just absent from their homes. Their absence had begun generating physical contradictions. One car here, one van there, a phone in one place, another phone later in another place, identification and clothing in a recycling bin. Each fact was incomplete. Together they formed a structure no family wanted to believe, but no honest observer could ignore. Have you ever noticed how quickly people reach for a harmless explanation, even after the facts stop supporting it? Maybe because harmless explanations are easier to live with for one more night. Put this in the comments. At what point would you stop calling a disappearance strange and start calling it a likely crime? By mid-December, the legal posture had already hardened. TF1 reported that an information judiciaire had been opened and that investigators had already searched multiple areas and heard numerous people close to the couple. Kévin's parents publicly spoke of kidnapping and confinement. That shift matters because courts do not move into those categories casually. It reflected how seriously the missing person file had begun to look. Even before the public knew who might be involved, the case was leaving the territory of routine worry and entering the territory of suspected coercion. Tom Trulet's place in this phase is impossible to ignore. Public accounts show that he was present in the search environment, spoke to the media, and initially appeared as part of the circle trying to understand what had happened. TF1 quoted him describing the house as available to the couple and saying investigators could keep it under seal if necessary. RTL later described how he had seemed heavily involved in the search before, according to that reporting, becoming more distant and less cooperative. Patrick Hoorelbeke also publicly complained that messages were handed over only in fragments and that some had been deleted. None of that alone solved the case in December 2022, but it contributed to the growing sense that silence was not merely the victim's condition. It was spreading into the conduct and omissions of the people around the last known night. That is another hard lesson here. In high-profile disappearances, investigators are not only reading what is missing from the victims, they are reading what is missing from everybody else. Missing candor, missing data, missing messages, missing certainty about where someone really was. Silence can exist in a phone, in a driveway, in a container, in a family home, and in a witness statement. When several kinds of silence start overlapping, cases change fast. The emotional temperature of the case rose because the facts were refusing to behave like chance. Two recent partners vanish after a social evening among known people. Their communication stops. Their vehicles separate. Their belongings are discarded far away. Families say this is impossible to reconcile with voluntary departure. Police widen the inquiry. Local and national media begin charting the same troubling pattern. Nobody had found Leslie or Kévin yet, but the case was already teaching the public a brutal principle. Before homicide is proven, disorder often appears first. Not a theatrical disorder. Practical disorder. Everyday life ceases to line up. This stage also changed the role of hope. The first days, hope speaks loudly. By the second and third week, hope becomes quieter and more technical. It attaches itself to search zones, call logs, towers, witness recollections, and one more possible sighting. Families keep moving because stopping would feel like betrayal. Yet every new fact can wound them while also helping the case. Finding Kévin's license did not answer the biggest question, but it damaged the smallest remaining illusions. The same was true of the vehicles and the phone signals. The investigation advanced by hurting hope. That is one reason these cases leave such lasting scars on relatives. Even the useful discoveries arrive as losses. There was also a psychological shift in the public during these weeks that deserves attention. Early coverage still spoke in the language of mystery. By late December and January, that language was changing. Reports increasingly emphasized the mismatch between the known facts and any harmless explanation. The last evening was ordinary, yet the aftermath was not. Leslie's family was open about the suffering of waiting. Emily Cardre told TF1 that the passing hours felt endless, while Patrick described a daughter who simply did not vanish without a word. BFM TV later reported fresh volunteer searches in Charente-Maritime, near the zone connected to Kévin's phone activity, showing how the geography of fear had expanded beyond Deux-Sèvres itself. Once searches had to stretch outward like that, the public could feel that this was no longer a narrow local concern, but a widening criminal puzzle with human stakes growing heavier each week. Another detail added to the pressure: money. TF1 reported that Kévin had been carrying close to 10,000 euros around the time of the disappearance, according to his stepmother, who said the cash was meant for buying a vehicle on its own. That did not explain the case, but it did make the disappearance feel even less accidental to many observers. Cash, vehicles, changing phone locations, missing personal effects, and a recent couple gone silent, all at once create the kind of pattern that investigators cannot treat lightly. The public still lacked a full answer, But by that point, the file already contained the raw materials of something far worse than a lover's quarrel or an impulsive departure. It contained money, movement, concealment, and fear. That was the real turn of the screw. Nothing decisive had been announced yet, but almost every new fact made innocence harder to defend. The case was still officially searching for 2 missing people. Emotionally, however, many families and viewers had already begun preparing for a truth they dreaded to name openly. If you value true crime that respects facts and still asks what ordinary people can learn from them, press like and subscribe to Bedtime Black Files stories. The point is not to turn grief into noise. The point is to study how real danger shows itself before the final answer arrives. By the close of 2022, the disappearance of Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat had crossed a line that everyone could feel, even if they could not yet fully describe it. The case no longer looked like 2 young adults who had gone quiet for private reasons. It looked like a forced break in the normal flow of life. Families sensed it. Reporters could see it in the growing contradictions. The investigators were building on it. The facts had not yet yielded the bodies, the autopsies, or the full chain of accusation, but they had already done something irreversible. They had taught everyone watching that silence, in this case, was not empty space. Where was the first visible shape of violence? And once silence becomes evidence, the next stage is inevitable. The case begins asking not only where the missing are, but who had the opportunity, who controlled the setting, who benefited from confusion, and who could no longer hide behind ordinary friendship. That is where this story turns next. From missing traces to the men who would move from the edge of the case toward its center. By the time the case reached this stage, fear no longer depended on intuition alone. In the beginning, relatives felt that something was wrong because Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat were acting unlike themselves. Now the case has moved beyond instinct. Now objects were speaking. A phone that stopped in the wrong place. Van found where it should not have been. Identity papers thrown away far from home. Personal effects separated from the people who needed them. These were not dramatic clues in the cinema sense. They were worse. They were everyday items proving that ordinary life had been interrupted by force, concealment, or both. Public reporting summarized in your case briefly identifies 3 major signals that redirected the inquiry. Personal effects discovered in a clothing container in Pyrovolt, telephony traces showing movement and contradiction, and behavioral inconsistencies among people tied to the last known night. Together, those signals pushed the case out of the language of concern and into the language of crime. That transition is important because many viewers think criminal cases turn on one shocking revelation. Often they do not. Often the truth enters as a chain of practical objections. Why is one vehicle here and the other there? Why are identity documents in a textile container? Why did one phone stop in one place and the other later in another place? Why do timelines offered by people around the victims stop matching the digital record when enough small facts stop fitting together? Innocence does not disappear all at once. It gets cornered. The phones mattered because phones almost always outlive the last voluntary movement of a victim. Public reporting cited in the uploaded brief describes telephony and digital traces as central to the investigation, including tower data, messaging, and location indications that supported hypotheses of coordinated movement and false alibis. That point should not be rushed past. In a case built around a familiar circle, phones do more than track victims. They test the honesty of everyone else. They show who was near whom, who communicated when they later denied it, and whether claimed locations are supported by the network record or contradicted by it. In this file, telephony was not a side note. It was one of the tools that stripped away the safe story and replaced it with a harder one. The same brief also notes that investigators later used witnesses and digital traces to establish the last known window around the early hours of November 26, 2022, after an evening in Prahecq. That means the case was narrowing its own clock. The broad disappearance had already become a smaller and more threatening question. What happened after the social evening ended in the short stretch of time when Leslie and Kévin should have been doing something simple, something harmless, something that should have led to sleep and an ordinary morning? Every technical trace pulled that time window tighter. Every inconsistency made it harder for anyone around the case to hide inside vagueness. Vehicles pushed the same logic into the physical world. Earlier chapters established that the couple vanished together, but their transport did not tell a unified story. The uploaded brief describes how geography became central to the case. The disappearance began in a small commune in Dussèvres. Key physical evidence surfaced across departmental lines in Charente-Maritime, and later the bodies were found in rural outdoor sites consistent with concealment and delayed discovery. That widening map matters. A voluntary departure usually creates continuity. A criminal event often creates scattering. The more the map expanded, the less the couple looked like two adults who had simply made an abrupt private choice. The more it looked as if their belongings, devices, and routes had been managed by other hands. This is the chapter where innocent explanations start running out. A missing phone might be a dead battery. Two missing phones with different trails are something else. A misplaced wallet might be a chance. Identification documents and multiple personal effects in a clothing collection container across departmental lines are something else. A car left behind might be poor planning. Two people gone, a recent relationship cut short, a dog missing, one vehicle left, and another found elsewhere is something else again. Cases become frightening in stages. And this was the stage where routine misfortune could no longer carry the weight of the facts. The discovery on December 8th, 2022 was one of the sharpest turns in the entire case. The brief states that identity documents and personal effects were found in or near a clothing collection container in Prahecq, and that this became a major lead. It also notes the reasoning that followed. Voluntary flight becomes much less plausible when key identity items are discarded far from home. That point is almost brutally simple. People who wish to vanish do not usually begin by carelessly tossing the very documents that define movement, employment, money, and identity. And if they do not usually do it in a way that suggests hurried disposal mixed with clothing and assorted belongings. The container in Prahecq did not answer the whole case, but it destroyed one comforting lie, that Leslie and Kévin had quietly stepped away from life on their own terms. Pause here and think about what that means beyond this one case. Most danger does not announce itself with a speech. Most danger leaves management marks. A message deleted. A location denied. Bag moved. A document discarded. A friend too eager to explain before anyone even knows what must be explained. Tell me in the comments, what do you trust more in a missing person case? What people say, or what objects refuse to stop saying? The objects, in this case, kept saying the same thing. Nothing about the disappearance was coherent on its own terms. Public reporting summarized in the brief also emphasizes behavioral inconsistencies and contradictions among persons involved in searches or providing schedules and alibis. That is where the human and technical sides of the investigation finally started locking together. A tower record by itself can be incomplete. A witness statement by itself can be mistaken. A changed demeanor by itself can mean fear, guilt, stress, or nothing at all. But when telephony, discarded effects, and shifting accounts begin pointing in the same direction, investigators stop dealing with isolated oddities. They start seeing structure. In this case, that structure suggested that the disappearance was not simply being misunderstood, was being obscured. That is also why the friend's circle began to look less like background and more like a filter placed over the truth. The same social closeness that made the final plan feel normal also made early deception easier. If someone says they were supposed to stay here, that sounds practical. If someone says I was elsewhere, that sounds ordinary. If a person joins searches, speaks calmly, offers selective details, and stands near grieving relatives, that can buy time. Public reporting later cited in the brief noticed behavioral changes and contradictions that alerted investigators. Those words matter because they reveal a grim pattern common in many cases involving acquaintances. Proximity can be used as cover. People closest to a disappearance sometimes help define the early public narrative, and if that narrative is false, every hour it survives delays the truth. The more the case developed, the less these contradictions looked accidental. The uploaded report describes the investigation as a progression from a worrying disappearance to a criminal case involving alleged kidnapping, false imprisonment, concealment, and later charges consistent with assassination under French law. That progression did not happen because the police suddenly changed their mood. It happened because the evidence kept refusing the language of a harmless absence. The turn from disappearance to criminal characterization was not decorative wording. It was the law catching up with the physical logic of the case. By now, the map itself had become an argument. Prahecq held the last social window. Poirevaux held discarded personal effects. Charente Maritime kept returning to the case, as if the truth were dragging the investigation there bit by bit. This is one of the unexpected turns that gives the real story its force. The answer did not first emerge from a confession broadcast to the public or from a single witness stepping forward dramatically. It emerged from a distance. The case widened geographically before it closed morally. What looked at first like a local disappearance began pointing across department lines, and that widening reach made the situation look more deliberate, not less. There is a powerful lesson in that. Distance can lie. Familiarity can lie. But the pattern usually does not. That is the full circle truth beginning to form here. In part 1, the story opened with silence. In part 4, that silence has acquired shape. It sits inside phones, cars, locations, bins, and contradictions. The case is no longer asking only where Leslie and Kévin are. It is asking who kept moving the story after Leslie and Kévin could no longer move it themselves. If you value true crime that follows facts carefully and still finds real lessons inside them, like this video now, and subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. Every case like this teaches something more than fear. It teaches what to notice before a false story hardens around missing people. The report also notes that the investigation involved around 120 interviews, technical and scientific police acts, and searches of water points. That scale matters. When cases become public, people sometimes assume police are merely waiting for the one miracle clue. In reality, difficult cases are often built through patient accumulation, witness after witness, technical check after technical check, search after search. That patience can look slow from the outside, especially to families living minute by minute. But in cases with multiple accused, overlapping social ties and contested movements, patience is often the only way to prevent the truth from being buried beneath noise. And noise is exactly what this case resisted. There were rumors, there were theories, there was public speculation, but the hardest facts kept coming from things that could be placed, timed, or recovered. A body is not yet found, but belongings are. A full account is not yet known, but tower data is. The motive is not yet settled, but concealment is beginning to show itself through the geography of discarded items. This is why Part 4 matters so much in the overall script. It is the stage where emotion stops leading the case and evidence starts carrying it forward. The unexpected twist is not a fictional one. It is that some of the most important steps toward truth came from humble objects most people barely think about when life is normal. Phone, a driving document, clothing, toiletries, a vehicle parked in the wrong place. These are the things people toss on a seat, into a bag, beside a bed. Yet when violence enters a life, those ordinary things become witnesses. They tell investigators whether someone traveled willingly, whether someone planned to return, whether someone else tried to erase the path, whether the story being told can survive contact with fact. In that sense, the objects in this case became more dependable than many of the living people around it. That is a hard moral revelation, but it is the honest one. People can distort. People can perform grief, innocence, confusion, or helpfulness. People can adjust their tone to the room. But objects do not need to be remembered consistently. They only need to be found. The identity papers in Prahecq did not care who was watching. The telephony records did not care who sounded convincing in public. The map did not care who claimed to be where. One by one, ordinary pieces of life turned against the version of events that innocence required. By the close of this phase, the case had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The evidence had not yet publicly yielded all roles, all motives, or all bodies, but it had already done something decisive. It had destroyed the last stable shelter for harmless explanations. Leslie and Kévin were no longer just missing. Their absence was being managed, their traces were being displaced, and the setting around their disappearance was beginning to look less like a social circle and more like a closed corridor through which truth would have to be forced. That is the moral at the end of this chapter, and it circles all the way back to where this story began. Silence is dangerous, not only because it hides people. Silence is dangerous because it gives false stories room to grow. The only thing that breaks that space is fact, not drama, not a rumor, not whoever talks first. Fact. In the Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat case, ordinary objects became the first hard rebellion against the lie. They were the first warning that trust had been used against two young people, and that somebody near them was counting on confusion to last longer than truth did not. And that is where the story must go next. Once innocent explanations are gone, the case stops asking whether a crime happened and starts asking who built the trap, who carried it out, who helped move the aftermath, and who believed that friendship would protect them from suspicion. The next part enters that darker human territory, not through fantasy, but through the accused men, whose names now stand near the center of one of France's most haunting recent homicide cases. What makes this section of the case so useful for viewers is that it teaches a practical discipline of attention. When a disappearance involves recent plans, known people, and a narrow time window, do not ask only who seemed upset or who talked the most. Ask what became disconnected from ordinary life. Did the missing person leave behind medicine, work tools, pet care, keys, transport, identity papers, or routine digital habits? Did the explanation require too many coincidences at once? In this case, the full circle warning is simple and severe. Trust can be manipulated, but logistics usually expose the manipulation. The body may remain hidden for a time, but movement leaves residue. A false alibi may sound steady, but towers, timestamps, and travel gaps are steadier. That is why this chapter matters before the arrests arrive. It shows the exact moment when the case stopped being powered by fear alone and started being driven by contradiction that could be tested, checked, mapped, and eventually carried into court. That is the bitter comfort here. Even when people fail the truth, the neglected details of ordinary life can still rise, connect, and point homeward. By the time the case reached the point where names moved from the edge of the story to its center, the public already understood one hard truth. Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat had not simply vanished. Their silence had been framed by discarded belongings, conflicting movements, and a narrowing timeline around Prahecq. Part 5 is where that tightening finally turns human, not into fantasy, not into easy certainty, but into the difficult question every serious criminal case must ask. Who, among the people closest to the last known night, was suspected of building the path that led Leslie and Kévin into death? The answer did not arrive cleanly. It arrived through arrests, custody statements, partial admissions, denials, changing roles, and a judicial theory that spread responsibility across several men rather than one lone attacker. The first name to draw the country's attention was Tom Prahecq. He entered the case first as a friend. His house in Prahecq was part of the couple's overnight plan. That detail alone would have kept him close to the investigation, but public reporting later described something far more serious. Tom became the principal suspect in the public narrative because investigators found contradictions between what he had suggested early on and what technical evidence indicated later. RTL reported that he had seemed highly involved in searches at first, then grew more distant, while Leslie's father publicly complained that Tom handed over messages only little by little and that some had been deleted. The significance of that conduct was not that it proved murder on its own. The significance was that it made the house, the host, and the final known arrangement impossible to treat as neutral context any longer. Public reporting in 2025 shows just how central prosecutors believe Tom's role was. TF1 stated that he was sent to the assize court, not only for the murders, but also for instigation to murder. Le Parisien similarly described him as the main organizer in the investigating judge's order. That is a major claim in legal terms. It means the prosecution theory is not merely that Tom was nearby when violence happened, but that he helped set it in motion. Yet even here, realism matters. An accusation is not a verdict. The public record supports saying that prosecutors placed him at the center of the alleged trap. It does not permit pretending that every disputed detail has already been finally judged. What made Tom's place in the case so haunting was the full circle betrayal built into it. The house that should have represented convenience and safety became, in the prosecution theory, the entry point into fatal violence. TF1's reporting on the October 2024 reconstruction says the investigators treated the small house in Prahecq as the place where Leslie and Kévin were attacked around 3 a.m. That reporting also notes that one of the accused, Nathan B., broke down in tears when he re-entered the house during the reconstruction, which gives a sense of how fixed that location had become in the judicial reading of events. The case no longer viewed the house as a passive backdrop. It viewed it as the place where the final ordinary plan ended. The second key name is Nathan B. His role in the public file is crucial because he is the accused most directly associated in reporting with the description of the ambush itself. RTL reported that Nathan told investigators the group acted under Tom's orders and that he arrived with others to assault and kill Leslie and Kévin. TF1's reconstruction coverage also places Nathan inside the core dispute over what happened in the house, including who struck whom and in what sequence. Nathan was later sent to the assize court on murder charges, according to TF1 and Le Parisien. But just as important as what he said is what remains unstable around what he said. His statements reportedly implicated others while minimizing parts of his own responsibility, which is common in multi-accused cases. So Nathan stands at the center of the trap, not only as an accused participant, but also as a contested narrator of the crime. Nathan's place in the story also shows how messy justice can be before trial. In 2025, he was released because of a procedural failure linked to a detention hearing, a development that deeply upset the victims' families. Yet that release did not erase the case against him. TF1 and Le Parisien both indicate that he still remained among the men sent to the assize court. That distinction matters morally as well as legally. Families often experience pretrial release as collapse, while the legal system treats it as a procedural event that may leave the underlying accusations intact. In a story like this, it becomes another source of pain. The truth may be advancing, but it rarely advances cleanly. The third name is Enzo C. Public reporting places him in a role that may look smaller than murder at first glance, but is morally heavy all the same. Le Parisien reported that he was sent to the assize court for complicity in murder, specifically for allegedly providing the vehicle used to transport the bodies and serving as a lookout when the crime was committed. TF1 gives the same charging direction. That matters, because it tells us something about how prosecutors see the case as a whole. This was not treated as a sudden private fight that got out of hand. It was treated as a coordinated episode in which different men allegedly contributed different functions: luring, violence, movement, watchkeeping, and later concealment. In that structure, the person who supplies a car or stands watch is not outside the crime. He's part of the machine that makes it possible. The fourth name is Mikhail Z. He appears less often in broad public coverage than Tom or Nathan, but the latest charging information makes his place impossible to ignore. TF1 and Le Parisien both say that Mikhail was sent to the assize court on murder charges. That tells us prosecutors believe his role was not merely peripheral or post-crime. It placed him among the men allegedly involved in the killing itself. Cases like this often produce uneven public visibility, where one or two accused dominate headlines and others remain dimmer figures. But the charging structure is a warning against that simplification. Legal responsibility in group violence can be distributed across people the public barely knows by name. Sometimes the least discussed defendant still carries one of the gravest alleged roles. The fifth name is Steven M. If Tom, Nathan, Enzo, and Mikhail represent the alleged building and execution of the trap, Steven represents the terrible moral world that can open after the killings are done. According to TF1 and Le Parisien, Steven was sent to court on charges tied to changing the crime scene and concealing corpses. That is different from being charged with murder, but it is not morally small. It means prosecutors believe he helped the crime survive beyond the moment of death by disrupting the truth that bodies and scenes might otherwise have revealed sooner. Cases involving body movement always carry a special kind of coldness. They suggest that after panic, rage, or whatever triggered the violence, there was still time left over for management. Someone kept thinking. Someone kept choosing. Someone treated the dead as a problem to be moved. Put yourself in the position of the families for a moment. It is one thing to learn that your child was attacked. It is another to learn that several people may have had a hand in what followed. Tell me in the comments which feels more frightening to you. One violent person acting alone, or a group in which each person takes one piece of the job. That is the true shock of part 5. The prosecution theory did not describe one man losing control in a single instant. It described a social crime. A crime with roles. TF1's reconstruction coverage says investigators were still working through who delivered the fatal blows to Kévin in the house, what happened to Leslie afterward, and how the bodies were moved. That continuing uncertainty is not a weakness in this case. It is the reality of multi-accused homicide. Several men may have participated, but each has reason to move blame onto someone else. In that environment, truth is not only hidden from families, it is also broken apart among defendants whose interests are opposed. Another reason the circle around the accused drew such intense attention is that the emerging prosecution theory matched the geography of the evidence. Hughes reported in March 2023 that belongings belonging to the couple had been found in Prahecq, only a few hundred meters from the home of Nathan's parents, while phone records had already contradicted Tom's early claim that he had simply been away at a techno night. According to that report, his communications showed that he returned to the village during the evening and exchanged messages with Leslie late into the night. None of those details alone proves the final sequence, but together they explain why investigators stopped looking only at disappearance and began mapping proximity, access, and opportunity. In other words, the men at the center of the trap did not arrive there because of rumor. They arrived there because the technical record, the movement of objects, and the social map of the final night kept narrowing around the same small cluster of names. Then every denial, missing message, and claimed alibi had to survive contact with a case file growing more exact, more connected, steadily with each passing week. the motive question deepens that complexity. TF1 reported that investigators were considering three main lines during the reconstruction: emotional grievance involving Tom and Leslie, drug trafficking linked to Kévin, and money. RTL similarly described a theory in which Tom and Kévin were involved in drug dealing together, and a conflict grew around debt, while also noting the broader atmosphere of emotional tension. What matters for this part of the script is not choosing a single motive too early. What matters is seeing how motive may have worked as a bridge between the men. A grievance can recruit help if money is promised. Debt can be turned into fear. Romantic disappointment can be mixed with wounded pride. In group crime, motives do not always need to be shared equally. One man's obsession can become another man's opportunity. That is why this part needs realism rather than melodrama. The unexpected twist in the true story is not some secret masked stranger stepping out at the last minute. The twist is that the route to violence seems to have passed through ordinary male friendship, local access, and overlapping interests. The same circle that made the couple feel socially anchored may also have been the circle through which danger spread. That is a harsher truth than stranger violence because it forces viewers to face a difficult moral fact. Closeness is not the same thing as safety. Familiar men can build unfamiliar harm. If this kind of fact-based true crime is the reason you're here, like the video and subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. Cases like this show that survival lessons do not only come from learning what monsters look like. They come from learning how ordinary trust can be used by ordinary-looking people. The October 2024 reconstruction sharpened that lesson. TF1 reported that the exercise lasted 2 nights, involved around 60 gendarmes, and returned the accused to key locations in Prahecq and beyond. Reconstructions are not theatre. They are tests. Can a claimed timeline actually work? Could a body have been moved that way? Was a given defendant really outside, inside, driving, watching, or arriving later, as he says? In this case, the reconstruction mattered because parts of the facts had been partly recognized, yet the roles still remained disputed. That is exactly what one would expect if several men were involved, but no one wanted to carry the whole moral and legal weight alone. And here the full circle moral revelation comes into view. In the opening chapters, the threat seemed to be silence. In this chapter, we understand that the greater threat may have been participation. Silence alone cannot move bodies. Silence alone cannot provide a vehicle, hold watch, reshape a scene, or sustain contradictory stories for months. What made the case so devastating was not only that Leslie and Kévin were allegedly targeted. It was that several men, according to prosecutors, may each have carried one part of the burden required to make the crime work. The case becomes a study in how evil can divide labor while trying to divide blame at the same time. That moral is worth sitting with. People often imagine conscience as a private shield, something that automatically stops a person before the irreversible act. But group crime shows the weakness of that hope. One man says yes to the plan. Another says yes to the ride. Another says yes to standing nearby. Another says yes to hiding what comes after. None may think of himself as carrying the whole crime, yet the dead still end up dead. Leslie and Kévin's case forces us to confront how catastrophe can be assembled by several small yeses, each one cowardly enough to rely on the others. So part 5 closes on a warning, larger than this one file. Be careful with circles built on vague loyalties, hidden debts, bruised egos, and access to secluded places. The person most dangerous to you may not be the loudest. It may be the one who offers the room, knows your route, understands your habits, and can bring other people into the plan without raising an alarm. That is the full circle truth here. The trap was powerful because it borrowed the shape of friendship before it showed the purpose of violence. Once that is understood, the next chapter becomes unavoidable. We have met the accused men at the center of the trap. Now the story must move to the hardest turn of all, the discovery of the bodies, the autopsies, and the first answers that no family ever once confirmed. What makes this section of the case so useful for viewers is that it teaches a practical discipline of attention. When a disappearance involves recent plans, known people, and a narrow time window, do not ask only who seemed upset or who talked the most. Ask what became disconnected from ordinary life. Did the missing person leave behind medicine, work tools, pet care, keys, transport, identity papers, or routine digital habits? Did the explanation require too many coincidences at once? In this case, the full circle warning is simple and severe. Trust can be manipulated, but logistics usually expose the manipulation. The body may remain hidden for a time, but movement leaves residue. A false alibi may sound steady, but towers, timestamps, and travel gaps are steadier. That is why this chapter matters before the arrests arrive. It shows the exact moment when the case stopped being powered by fear alone and started being driven by contradiction that could be tested, checked, mapped, and eventually carried into court. That is the bitter comfort here. Even when people fail the truth, the neglected details of ordinary life can still rise, connect, and point homeward. When a missing person case lasts long enough, families begin living two realities at once. In one reality, they keep searching because stopping feels like betrayal. In the other, they start fearing that every useful discovery may also be the one that destroys the last living form of hope. That is where the Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat case stood by the first days of March 2023. The map had widened. The phones had turned troubling. Personal effects had been found in Prahecq. Suspects had been taken into custody. The disappearance no longer looked voluntary. The case then crossed the line no family ever once crossed. The search stopped being about where Leslie and Kévin might be alive. It became about where their bodies had been hidden. The turn came fast. Once investigators moved decisively against the men they suspected. Public reporting shows that during the final days of February and the opening days of March 2023, several people were taken into custody, and the custodial phase produced something investigators had been missing for more than 3 months: usable direction. BFM-TV and news reported that the bodies were found after at least one of the suspects provided information that guided the searches in Charente Maritime. That detail matters because it reveals how the case finally broke open. It's not a pure chance. It was pressure, contradiction, and the collapse of concealment under interrogation. Until then, the truth had been buried not only in rural ground, but also in silence maintained by the living. The first body was found on Friday, March 3rd, 2023, in Puervo. The prosecutor later described it as the body of a male person, exhumed from a field along a path. The second body was found the next day, Saturday, 4 March, in a wooded area near Viersen, in the hamlet of Les Hayes. This 2-stage recovery was one of the cruelest details in the public unfolding of the case. The families and the country did not receive one single devastating announcement. They received the truth in 2 blows, one body, then the next, with only a few kilometers separating the sites, and yet an emotional distance impossible to measure. Public reporting from the time made clear that the searches focused on the same broad zone already linked to the recovery of the couple's belongings in December. The landscape itself had been hinting at the answer for weeks. Kévin's body was found first. Leslie was found the following morning. Even before formal confirmation, there was little room for realistic doubt among investigators or families about what the discoveries meant. But the law still had to move in order. The prosecutor initially stated that the identities were not yet formally established and that autopsies would follow. That procedural caution is important in a case like this, because it shows the difference between what grief already knows and what criminal justice still has to prove. Families can recognize catastrophe instantly. Courts must still document it, identify it, classify it, and eventually carry it into charges and trial. Those 2 days changed the moral shape of the entire case. Up to that point, France had been following a disappearance investigation with rising criminal suspicion. After the discoveries, the public was confronted with a double killing. That matters for storytelling, but it matters even more for truth. Missing person cases allow a kind of suspended language. People speak of mystery, concern, absence, and hope. Once bodies are recovered, those softer words no longer fit. The case becomes concrete in the harshest possible way. Someone did not merely cause worry. Someone caused death. Someone then kept the dead out of sight for months. The physical locations of the recoveries also carried their own message. Puervo was not a random dot on a map. It was already known to investigators because belongings belonging to Leslie and Kévin had been found there in December in a clothing recycling container. When Kévin's body was recovered in that same broad sector, the earlier discovery of documents and personal items suddenly looked even more direct in meaning. The discarded effects had not been a strange side trail. They had been part of the same zone of concealment. Viersen, where Leslie's body was recovered, lay only a few kilometers away. The distance between the 2 recovery sites suggests not chaos, but management. This was not a case in which 2 people vanished into open uncertainty. It was a case in which their remains were separated, hidden, and left for the land to keep until human pressure forced the truth back out. That is one of the hardest lessons here. Violence does not end at the moment of killing. In many cases, a second moral crime begins immediately after death. The decision to transport, bury, cover, divide, or dispose. That second phase is not accidental. It requires time, movement, and a willingness to treat human bodies as obstacles to self-protection. In Leslie and Kévin's case, the recovery sites exposed exactly that additional cruelty. The attackers, whoever delivered which blow, did not leave the truth where it fell. They put labor into hiding it. The bodies were found. The autopsies became the next source of hard answers. BFM TV reported that they were conducted on Sunday and Monday at the Criminal Research Institute of the Gendarmerie in Pontoise. Those examinations had several urgent purposes: confirm identity, determine likely cause of death, look for signs of sexual assault, and clarify whether the two victims had died in the same broad period. In public imagination, autopsies are sometimes treated like magic keys that unlock every last detail. Realistically, they do something more restrained and often more powerful. They narrow the lie. They tell investigators what did not happen, what probably did happen, and what remains uncertain. The prosecutor's public statement, after those examinations, delivered the first fixed answers. The two bodies were identified, almost formally, notably through tattoos. Both victims had probably been killed by blows delivered with a blunt object. There was no sign of sexual assault against Leslie. The prosecutor also indicated that the killings appeared to have occurred within a reduced time frame. That last phrase is easy to miss, but it is important. It suggests that Leslie and Kévin were not lost across a long sequence of separate events unfolding over days. It suggests a concentrated burst of lethal violence near the beginning of their disappearance. In other words, the hope that they may have stayed alive somewhere after the first hours was not supported by the medical findings. That confirmation altered the emotional burden carried by the families. For more than 3 months, they had lived inside a tormenting uncertainty. Certainty is often described as relief in criminal cases, but that word is too simple here. The families did not receive relief. They received the end of false possibilities. That matters because many people outside such cases assume that knowing is always easier than not knowing. In truth, knowing can simply replace one kind of agony with another. Before the recoveries, Leslie's father and Kévin's relatives were fighting the fear that something terrible had happened. After the autopsies, they had to begin living inside the proof that it had. The public reaction reflected that shift. White marches were organized. Q's reported that around 300 people gathered in Niort on March 12, 2023 to honor Kévin, with participants carrying flowers and t-shirts bearing messages of remembrance. Coverage described his father calling for justice. Public mourning in cases like this does more than express sadness. It also records a community's refusal to let the victims be remembered only as bodies recovered from fields and woodland. Leslie and Kévin had entered the national news as missing names. They now had to be reclaimed as human beings whose lives were larger than the brutality used to end them. There was another practical consequence of the recoveries that is easy to overlook. Once Leslie and Kévin were found in separate places, every prior statement about transport and timing had to be reread with a new seriousness. Separate burial or concealment sites suggest decisions, not just panic. They suggest movement after death, access to vehicles or routes, and at least some knowledge of rural terrain. That is why the discovery phase did not only close the missing person file, it also forced investigators to think more carefully about cooperation. One person can kill. One person can bury. But when two victims are hidden in different locations and belongings appear elsewhere, the question of whether several people shared the work becomes impossible to ignore. The ground itself begins indicating coordination. That point also reshapes how we understand the month before the discoveries. The long delay did not mean the case lacked direction. It meant that concealment had bought time. Every day the bodies remained hidden, allowed doubts to survive, allowed stories to circulate, and allowed those under suspicion to benefit from uncertainty. Once the recoveries happened, that advantage started collapsing. The same passage of time that had protected the hidden crime now turned against it, because decomposition, geography, object placement, and phone records could be read together rather than separately. In many homicide cases, evidence feels fragmented until the body is found. After that, fragments stop floating. They lock together. For the families, locking together can feel merciless. Details that once seemed disconnected suddenly align into a version of events no loving parent ever wanted to face clearly. The house in Prahecq, the missing dog, the discarded papers, the widening search zone, the silence from phones, all of it begins pointing in one direction at once. That is why body discovery chapters feel so devastating in real life. They do not add one fact. They reorder every fact already known. And once that reordering begins, even the smallest earlier detail can return with a weight nobody recognized at first. The discoveries did not simplify the case. They hardened it. Once the bodies were found, the investigation did not suddenly become easy. It became more precise and, in some ways, more difficult. Now every accused person's story had to be tested against burial sites, body movement, injury patterns, timing, and the geography of concealment. Now the law had to ask not only who lied, but who struck, who transported, who watched, who helped hide, and who shaped the false story afterward. Recovery is not the end of a homicide case. Recovery is the moment the dead begin arguing back through evidence. Pause here and consider the full circle warning already taking form. In the opening of this story, silence was the first sign that something had broken. In this chapter, the land itself answered that silence. A field, path, a wooded area. Those places did not create justice, but they ended denial. Tell me in the comments, which truth is harder to live with? Not knowing where someone is, or learning exactly how far someone went to make sure they would not be found. The recoveries also changed how the earlier evidence was understood. The phones, the vehicles, the discarded documents, the contradictions around the last night in Prahecq, all of it now sat inside a confirmed double homicide frame. That is why body recovery chapters are so important in well-structured true crime. They do not exist only to shock. They reclassify everything that came before. A delayed message is no longer just strange. It may be part of concealment. A misplaced vehicle is no longer just confusion. It may be part of staging. A missing dog is no longer just an unresolved side detail. It becomes part of a broader human scene, violently interrupted. The dead change the meaning of the living facts left behind. The prosecutor's description of a reduced time frame adds one more painful layer. Leslie and Kévin were young, newly together, and still inside the ordinary hope of a recent relationship. Public reporting later noted that they had been a couple for less than a month. When the medical findings suggested that both died within a condensed sequence, the case became even harder to hear. Their future did not slowly collapse over weeks. It appears to have been cut off almost immediately after the last ordinary night closed around them. That suddenness is part of what gives the case its lasting force. There was trust, then disappearance, then hidden death. If you value factual true crime that keeps the victims human and the lessons clear, like this video, and subscribe to Bedtime Black Files stories. Real cases matter most when they help us recognize how quickly normal life can be broken by hidden malice inside familiar settings. The medical findings also mattered because of what they ruled out. In cases involving a young woman and a hidden body, public speculation can become reckless very quickly. The prosecutor's statement that no sign of sexual assault had been found was therefore important both medically and morally. It did not lessen the cruelty of the crime. It simply prevented one form of baseless projection from taking over the public story. Likewise, identifying a blunt object as the likely murder weapon narrowed the range of possible scenarios. The killings looked neither distant nor abstract. They looked physical, close, and direct. Whoever killed Leslie and Kévin did so with force that had to be delivered at human range. This is where the first hard answers ended, and the next, more difficult stage began. Families now knew the worst had happened. Investigators now had bodies, injury patterns, sites, and a more stable legal basis for homicide accusations. The public now understood that the case was no longer vanishing with frightening overtones, but a double murder rooted in a circle of known people. Yet the most disputed questions were still waiting. Why were they killed? Who exactly did what? And how was the labor of the crime divided among the men already under suspicion? Body recovery can answer death. It does not automatically answer responsibility in full. That is the moral center of Part 6. Facts do not arrive in the order Payne wants them. Families wanted Leslie and Kévin home alive. Instead, the truth came in stages. First silence, then contradiction, then searches, then custody, then 2 bodies, then autopsy results. Justice often works this way, one hard layer at a time. The full circle lesson is brutal but clear. When trust is used as cover for violence, reality must fight its way back through land, objects, wounds, and time. Leslie and Kévin were hidden, but they were not erased. Once their bodies were found, the case stopped asking whether the worst had happened. It began demanding an answer to who made it happen, and what motive could possibly have been worth such ruin. That is where the next part belongs. Once Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat were found, the case changed from a search for the missing into a fight over sequence, roles, and intent. Bodies can confirm death. They do not automatically explain the minutes that led there. In this case, prosecutors and investigating judges gradually built a theory that was far more disturbing than a sudden fight between friends. Their working view, reflected in charges, reconstruction reporting, and later referral decisions, is that Leslie and Kévin were led into a planned ambush tied to a small circle of men who knew the place, knew the route, and knew exactly when the couple would be most exposed. What remains contested is not whether the public record points to a trap. It is who delivered which blow, who acted under whose direction, and whether the central motive was emotional grievance, debt, drug dealing, money, or a mixture of all 4. The prosecution theory did not appear all at once in one perfect statement. It emerged through arrests in early March 2023, through what suspects said in custody, through the recovery of the bodies, and later through a judicial reconstruction in October 2024 designed to test the competing versions against the physical locations. That matters because audiences sometimes expect a clean official script in complex homicide cases. Realistically, the state often works with a structure that is firm at the edges and disputed at the center. Here the edges have become relatively stable in public reporting. The murders are believed to have occurred around 3 a.m. on November 26, 2022, in the house at Prahecq. The bodies were transported away, and concealment followed before the V. Remains were eventually moved again and found months later in Charente-Maritime. That alleged sequence is one of the reasons the case hit France so hard. The trap, as prosecutors appear to see it, did not rely on kidnapping strangers from the road. It relied on ordinary trust. Leslie and Kévin expected sleep at Tom Troyle's house after an evening with friends. That detail remains the moral center of the file. It placed the victims inside a setting that felt socially safe. Later reporting from TF1 described the little stone house in Prahecq as the place where the 2 young adults were savagely killed around 3 a.m. during the night of 25 to 26 November 2022. According to the reconstruction framework used by investigators, the house ceased to be a practical address and became, in the state's reading of the case, the fixed point where hospitality was allegedly turned into access. Tom's role sits at the center of that theory. By September 2025, Le Parisien reported that the investigating judge's order treated him as the principal organizer, while TF1 and News described him as the alleged instigator or command figure around the gay apens. Public reporting has also long tied him to one of the 2 main motive lines, that he may have harbored feelings for Leslie, or that he was caught in financial tension with Kévin linked to drug dealing and debt. Those theories are not identical, and the public record does not yet force a single choice between them. What it does show is that prosecutors did not treat Tom as a passive bystander who happened to know the victims. They treated him as the man who, in their view, made the setting available, drew others into the plan, and stood at the center of the event that followed. Nathan B. occupies a different, but equally important place in the alleged sequence. Public reporting says he admitted part of his participation, while shifting the heaviest blame away from himself. TF1's reconstruction coverage says Nathan acknowledged knocking Kévin out, yet denied inflicting the fatal blow. RTL reported that Nathan described the group as acting under Tom's orders, and said they arrived to assault and kill Leslie and Kévin once the pair had returned to the house. Those statements matter for 2 reasons. They support the theory of a coordinated ambush rather than a spontaneous quarrel, and they also show why the case remained difficult. A suspect can partly acknowledge the plan while still protecting his own position within it. In multi-accused violence, the truth often comes in damaged pieces, each piece carrying self-interest with it. Mikhail Z. appears less vividly in public coverage, but he remains central in the legal structure of the case. TF1's reconstruction account says he claimed memory loss and uncertainty about whether he struck anyone. By 2025, however, Le Parisien reported that he, along with Tom and Nathan, had been sent to the assize court for assassinations. That gap between a dim public profile and a severe accusation matters. It reminds us that public visibility and legal risk are not the same thing. Some defendants dominate headlines because they talk more, or because their names enter earlier. Others stay quieter, while still carrying exposure to the gravest charges. In the prosecution view, the fatal event at Prahecq was not reducible to one pair of hands. Enzo C. and Stephen M. illustrate the other side of the state's theory, that the crime did not end when the victims fell. Le Parisien reported that Enzo was referred for complicity in assassination, for having provided the vehicle used to transport the bodies, and for acting as lookout during the commission of the crime. The same order sent Stephen to court for modifying a crime scene and concealing corpses. Those allegations are essential to understanding what prosecutors believe happened that night and after. This was not in that account a scene of sudden rage ending in confusion and flight. It was a crime whose aftermath required movement, concealment, and role division. Someone waited outside. Someone drove. Someone handled the bodies. Someone altered what the dead and the room might have revealed more quickly. The reconstruction reporting gave the public the clearest narrative shape yet of how prosecutors think the night unfolded. TF1 said that during the reenactment, the accused mimed Leslie and Kévin being attacked in separate rooms, with Kévin in one room and Leslie in another, and with a machete and hammer figuring in the reconstructed violence. The same report described the men carrying the victims from the house to a vehicle outside. That matters because it reinforces the judicial suspicion that the couple were isolated, overpowered, and then removed from the original scene in a manner that required more than one person. It also shows why later debates about the precise fatal blow remained unresolved. If the violence was dispersed across rooms, weapons, and several men, the state still had to disentangle the exact moment each death occurred. The most haunting part of the later reconstruction is what it suggests about Leslie's final moments. TF1 reported that investigators were still trying to determine who would have killed Leslie in the trunk, and that Tom acted out blows delivered with a shovel to Leslie, while denying that he had killed her. That phrase is difficult to hear, but it matters because it captures the distinction prosecutors were still working through: participation in violence versus fatal responsibility. Public reporting around the autopsy had already suggested some uncertainty about the exact mechanism of Leslie's death because of decomposition and environmental degradation after concealment. The reconstruction, therefore, did not simply dramatize known facts. It tested whether the suspect's accounts could fit the physical possibility of the wounds, the body movement, and the narrow time frame. Kévin's final moments appear more tightly anchored to the house itself in the public record. TF1's coverage stated that investigators were trying to establish who delivered the fatal blow to him in the house, and Nathan's own reported admission placed him at least partly inside that violence by acknowledging that he knocked Kévin out. The implication is severe. If prosecutors are right, Kévin may have been neutralized inside a place where he believed he was about to sleep, not in open conflict, not while fleeing, but after entering the final secure point of the evening. That is one of the strongest full-circle revelations in the case. The threat was not waiting at the edge of the night. It was waiting at its destination. There is another element in the prosecution theory that deserves careful attention: intoxication. TF1's reconstruction report said that from the killings to the burial of the bodies, all were under drugs. That does not excuse anything. It does, however, help explain the atmosphere investigators may believe surrounding the violence. Bad judgment intensified by substances, aggression made harder to read in real time, and concealment decisions taken in a state where bravado, panic, and impaired conscience can mix. In many criminal cases, intoxication becomes a shield defendants later try to use. Here, if the reporting is accurate, it may instead help explain how a group could move from planned hostility into prolonged brutality without one person stopping the others. The geographical sequence after the killings is just as important as the violence in the house. TF1 reported that the bodies rested under a tent for 3 days near Magna, before being moved again to other sites in Charente-Maritime. That claim is extraordinary, and it deepens the moral weight of the file. It suggests that concealment was not a single hurried decision made before dawn. It suggests continuity. The dead were not simply hidden once and abandoned. They were managed, their location was temporary, their movement calculated, and the truth was kept in motion so that discovery would be delayed. In practical terms, this is one reason prosecutors seem to view the case as collective rather than solitary. A sequence involving attack, transport, temporary storage, later movement, and burial is logistically difficult for one person to carry out alone. If this case is making you think differently about how real danger can hide inside familiar plans, press like and subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. The goal here is not noise. It is to study the exact point where trust is used as an instrument against the people who offered it. The motive remains the loosest part of the theory, but even there, the public record gives shape. TF1 reported that investigators were working through 3 lines during the reconstruction: an emotional motive involving disappointment between Tom and Leslie, a drug trafficking background that may have involved Kévin, and money. The prosecutor had earlier described the possible motives more generally as sentimental disappointment and/or financial debts. These explanations are not mutually exclusive. In fact, the case may only make full sense if several forms of grievance overlapped. One man's resentment can recruit another man's greed. A debt can sharpen fear. An emotional fixation can make violence feel justified inside a distorted mind already used to criminal activity. That mixture is one reason the case resists any neat headline. That complexity is also why the prosecution theory has had to evolve without losing its core. In March 2023, the public mainly learned that suspects had been arrested, that one friend's alibi had been weakened by phone evidence, and that some men were accused of assassination, abduction, confinement, and crime scene modification. By October 2024, the reconstruction had added a more detailed working picture: separate rooms, multiple weapons, a vehicle waiting outside, a later phase of concealment near Magny, and unresolved disputes over which accused crossed from participation into the fatal act itself. By September and December 2025, the judicial orders had hardened that picture into a referral structure: Tom, Nathan, and Mikhail for assassinations, Enzo for complicity, Steven for concealment-related offences. The line from suspicion to theory to formal accusation is not complete proof, but it is a coherent legal story. One of the most revealing facts in that story is how small the alleged trap really was. It did not require a vast criminal network. It required a house, a route, a known sleeping arrangement, a few men, at least one vehicle, and a willingness to divide labor after the attack. That is why the case feels so frighteningly close to ordinary life. Many people imagine lethal plots as elaborate operations. This one, as prosecutors seem to describe it, was terrifying precisely because it was local, improvised within familiarity, and close enough to the victim's daily world that they did not have to be dragged toward it. They only had to keep following the plan they already believed in. That is the full-circle moral revelation at the center of Part 7. The danger was not hidden because it was distant. It was hidden because it wore the shape of convenience, friendship, and routine. Leslie and Kévin did not vanish into a myth. They appear in the prosecution theory, to have been funneled through a sequence that depended on ordinary trust at every stage, spend the evening with familiar people, head to a familiar house, expect sleep, find violence instead. Everything that followed, from the alleged blows to the transport and concealment, grew out of that first misuse of trust. There is a lesson here that goes beyond this file. When a plan depends entirely on one person's access, one person's space, one person's root knowledge, or one person's control over who else is present, safety can fail very quickly if that person is compromised. Most people look for danger in visible hostility. Cases like this warn that danger can also arrive through arrangement. The room is ready. The timing is known. The vehicle is nearby. The victim walks in under no pressure at all. By the time fear appears, the structure around them may already belong to someone else. Part 7 therefore closes not with final certainty, because the public record still shows disputed roles, but with the strongest account the prosecution seems prepared to defend. Leslie and Kévin were allegedly trapped in Prahecq by men who knew them, attacked around 3 a.m., carried out to a waiting vehicle, hidden for a time near Magna, and later buried in separate places in Charente-Maritime. Around that backbone, the unresolved questions remain heavy. Which suspect delivered the mortal blow to Kévin, who killed Leslie? How much of the motive was emotional, and how much was financial? And whether every accused knew from the start that the plan was meant to end in death? Those are the questions the courts must decide. This chapter's role is different. It shows how prosecutors say the night was built. The next one has to ask why. That question matters, because motive is where many audiences lose discipline. They want one answer, one trigger, one sentence. This file refuses that simplicity. People can join the crime for different reasons and still leave the same devastation behind. In Leslie and Kévin's case, the alleged trap may have been held together by resentment, debt, ego, fear, and opportunity all at once. That is where the story turns next. After bodies are found and suspects are identified, most people expect motive to bring clarity. They want one clean sentence, one grievance, one reason that makes the horror legible. This case refuses that comfort. By the time prosecutors had built their working theory of the killings of Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat, they were not speaking publicly about one tidy motive, but about several overlapping possibilities. Romantic disappointment connected to Tom Truelett and Leslie, financial conflict or debt, possible drug dealing around Kévin, and the role of money more broadly. The alleged trap may not have grown from one spark alone. It may have formed where wounded pride, criminal opportunity, resentment, and practical greed met in the same small circle. That complexity matters because it protects the story from becoming dishonest. Public reporting is consistent on the broad point, not the final answer. TF1 reported during the October 2024 reconstruction that investigators were working on 3 lines at once. An emotional motive involving disappointment between Tom and Leslie, possible drug trafficking involving Kévin, and money. Earlier, public statements from the prosecutor had already framed the likely background as sentimental disappointment and/or financial debts. That wording is careful for a reason. It signals a strong suspicion that emotional and financial conflict both mattered, while leaving room for the court to decide how they interacted and which factor was strongest. The emotional line is the one that most naturally catches public attention. If Tom felt rejected, humiliated, displaced or emotionally diminished by Leslie's recent relationship with Kévin. That would fit a pattern seen in many real homicide cases: grievance attached to entitlement. When a person thinks access to another human being is something owed rather than offered freely, rejection can become, in that distorted mind, not an ordinary hurt, but an insult requiring response. TF1's reconstruction coverage explicitly identified deception sentimentale between Tom and Leslie as one of the central lines explored by investigators. Public legal reporting in 2025, which placed Tom in the role of alleged organizer or instigator, gives that line more weight, because it suggests prosecutors do not view his connection to Leslie as incidental background. Yet, jealousy alone does not fully explain the public case record. If the motive were only emotional, many other features become harder to account for: the involvement of several men, the attention to vehicles, the geographic spread into Charente-Maritime, and the repeated appearance of financial language in public statements. The prosecutor's formula about financial debts kept returning because the case also seems to sit near a more transactional world, one in which money and small-scale criminal activity may have shaped loyalties and fear. TF1's reconstruction report says investigators were also working on the possibility of drug trafficking, in which Kévin may have been involved. That may point to something local and unstable: money owed, substances circulating, favors exchanged, and a circle where friendship and business were mixed badly enough that conflict could become dangerous. In many real cases, the emotional motive recruits the financial one, or the financial motive borrows force from the emotional one. A man who feels rejected may already have money trouble. A debt may become harder to resolve when ego is involved. A small criminal dispute may become lethal if one participant also feels mocked, replaced, or exposed. Group violence often comes from exactly this sort of overlap. One participant does not need to care equally about every motive. Another man may join for cash, another for loyalty, another because he fears losing standing in the group. The dead still end up dead, even when the living were not moved by the same private logic. RTL's reporting on Nathan B. adds another layer. According to RTL, Nathan told investigators the group acted under Tom's orders and that Tom portrayed himself as financially cornered by Kévin. RTL also described a background in which Tom and Kévin were allegedly connected through drug dealing and debt. That does not settle the truth. Nathan had every reason to shift blame upward and reduce his own agency. But it does show why the money line remained serious in public reporting. It was part of what suspects themselves were saying, and what journalists covering the judicial file kept identifying as a plausible explanation for why other men might have joined the alleged trap. Money changes the moral temperature of a case. Emotional grievance can look personal. Money introduces calculation. It asks who benefited, who felt trapped, who feared repayment, who expected a cut, who supplied a vehicle, and who found the risk acceptable if there was something material to gain or protect. That is one reason the line about Kévin carrying a large amount of cash around the time of the disappearance mattered so much in earlier coverage. Even if every detail of that claim is not equally central at trial, the public file repeatedly returned to the idea that money was in the air around the case. There is also a harder question beneath all of this. Why Kévin as well as Leslie? If Tom's grievance were purely romantic, the presence of multiple motives helps explain why both young people may have been targeted. The public case record shows Kévin repeatedly entering the motive discussion through debt, money, and possible drug dealing. That dual structure may explain why prosecutors did not settle on one emotional story. Leslie may have stood at the center of one man's resentment, while Kévin may have stood at the center of a financial or criminal conflict. If so, the alleged trap was shaped around the couple together, each carrying a different threat or grievance in the eyes of the accused. That possibility makes the case even more disturbing. It would mean the relationship between Leslie and Kévin, still new and still forming, became the point where two kinds of danger crossed. For Leslie, the danger may have come from being desired, misread, or emotionally claimed by someone who could not accept reality. For Kévin, the danger may have come from money, local criminal ties, or the simple fact that he stood where another man wanted to stand. The couple had been together for only a short time. The consequences, if the prosecution theory is right, were immediate and absolute. Put yourself in the place of the people around them for a moment. Which sign would you have read first? A friend acting possessive, money circulating without clear explanation, or the sense that a social group had become tense in ways nobody was naming aloud? Tell me in the comments which warning signal you think people miss most often: emotional entitlement, hidden debt, or loyalty to the wrong crowd. The group dimension of the case is one reason a mixed motive makes more sense than a single one. Public reporting and later referrals to the assize court indicate 5 accused men with different alleged functions: organizer, active participants in the killings, lookout, vehicle provider, and someone accused of helping alter scenes or hide bodies. That structure looks less like a lone act of romantic rage and more like a crime that required recruitment. Emotional obsession may be enough for one person, but money, debt, fear, or status can help draw others in. When prosecutors keep returning to money as well as sentiment, they are also explaining how a personal grievance may have become a group act. Another important feature of the motive question is how careful the public sources remain. Even TF1's detailed reconstruction piece did not present the motive as solved. It said investigators were working on 3 tracks, and that the purpose of the reconstruction was to help separate truth from self-serving fiction in a particularly complex file. That level of caution matters. It tells us that motive, in this case, is not a decorative label added after the fact. It is a contested issue being tested against statements, movements, and practical logistics. The emotional line should not be underestimated merely because it is common. Many murders grow out of humiliated ego more than grand feeling. A person does not have to love deeply to kill over rejection. He may only need to feel diminished, replaced, or laughed at. If Tom, as prosecutors appear to suspect, could not accept Leslie's distance or her choice to be with Kévin, then emotional injury may have supplied the insult that made other conflicts feel urgent. What makes this especially dangerous in real life is that emotional entitlement often hides under ordinary friendliness. The person still offers a room, answers a message, joins the search, or speaks calmly to others. Sometimes danger presents as continued access. The financial line is dangerous in a different way. Debt pulls people into action, not because they feel wounded, but because they feel cornered. Public reporting on the case repeatedly used the language of debts rather than abstract greed, and that matters. Debt comes with pressure, reminders, embarrassment, fear of exposure, and loss of standing. In a small social circle, those pressures do not stay on paper. They move through friendships, substances, favors, and private threats. That kind of setting can make violence feel, to the wrong mind, like a shortcut back to control The drug line sits beside both of these rather than replacing them. TF1 did not say investigators had proven a large trafficking network. It said they were examining possible drug trafficking involving Kévin. That distinction matters, because viewers should not imagine more than the source's support. Still, even the possibility is important. Where drugs circulate, so do cash, risk, secrecy, impulsive decisions, and people whose loyalty shifts quickly under pressure. Add resentment and debt to that setting, and the moral ground becomes very unstable. This leads to the full circle moral revelation of Part 8. The motive may have been mixed because the social world around the victims was mixed. Friendship and business were not clearly separated. Desire and access were not clearly separated. Hospitality and control were not clearly separated. People are trained to look for one category at a time: romance, money, drugs, anger. Real cases often combine them. A person may open the door for emotional reasons and keep it open for financial ones. Another may agree to help because he sees cash, fear, or group pressure on the table. In that environment, the crime does not belong to one clean story. It belongs to a poisoned mixture. That mixture also explains why this case resists the public temptation to ask, what was the real motive? There may not be one exclusive answer. The more honest question may be, which motive mattered most to which man? For Tom, prosecutors seem to suspect sentiment and control were central. For others, loyalty, money, or fear may have mattered more. Nathan's reported account points upward toward Tom's instructions. The referral structure in 2025 points outward toward distributed labor. The prosecutor's own language keeps sentiment and debt side by side. All of that suggests a hierarchy of motives rather than a single shared passion. Each accused may have entered the same crime through a different door. If you value true crime that stays faithful to evidence while still drawing real human lessons, like this video, and subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. The point is not to glamorize violence. The point is to show how danger often gathers where ego, money, secrecy, and access are allowed to blur together. The lesson for ordinary life is severe but useful. Be cautious when one person controls the place, another controls the money, another controls the ride, and nobody speaks plainly about what is owed to whom or who feels entitled to whom. That kind of social arrangement creates hidden leverage. The moment tension rises, the person with the room can become the person with the trap. The person with the debt can become the person with the fear. The person who thinks he deserves affection can become the person who punishes refusal. In Leslie and Kévin's case, prosecutors appear to believe that those pressures did intersect, and that the result was fatal. There is another reason. The mixed motive theory matters. It helps explain the effort of concealment after the killings. If several men shared different reasons for joining the crime, they also shared different reasons for hiding it. One may have feared prison. Another may have feared exposure of debts or drug activity. Another may have feared being identified as the man who struck the decisive blow. Another may simply have feared what the organizer would do if he talked. Mixed motives can therefore produce mixed concealment, with each participant protecting not only the group, but also his own private weakness. The tragedy inside that complexity is easy to state and hard to absorb. Leslie and Kévin were young. Their relationship was recent. Their plans for that night were small, ordinary, and local. Yet the allegations around their deaths reach into territory far larger than a simple night out gone wrong. The motive question tells us that the case may have been incubating inside the social world around them long before the final evening began. Emotional resentment may already have been growing. Financial pressure may already have been present. The road to violence may have been paved, not in one sudden hour, but in many small private resentments and calculations that only became visible after the worst had happened. That is why this chapter matters. It shows that catastrophe is often prepared long before violence is visible, in small permissions, hidden obligations, wounded ego, and money nobody explains. By the time the room feels unsafe, the decision may already be made there. That is where Part 8 must land. The prosecution theory of motive is not neat, because real human corruption is rarely neat. Jealousy, money, and drugs do not sit in separate boxes. They leak into one another. An insult becomes a debt problem. A debt problem becomes a status problem. A status problem becomes a group problem. A group problem becomes a murder case. The full circle warning here is as sharp as anything in this file. The most dangerous situations are often not the ones built on one visible threat, but the ones built on several half-hidden pressures all converging in the same room. Leslie and Kévin appear, in the public record, to have walked into exactly that kind of convergence. The next part must show what happened after the motive stopped being theory for the families and became a life-destroying public aftermath. Once Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat were found, the case ceased to belong only to investigators, judges, and suspects. It returned in full force to the people who had loved them, searched for them, defended their names, and refused to accept their disappearance as voluntary. Public grief became one of the defining features of the affair in March 2023. Yet this was not a simple period of shared mourning. The aftermath exposed fractures, different ways of carrying pain, and one terrible truth that often follows violent crime: death does not end destruction. It changes direction. What began as the loss of 2 young lives spread outward into families, rituals, public memory, anger, and even a second criminal case built around revenge. The first days after the formal identification of the bodies were marked by public homage. News and TF1 both reported that a white march took place in York on March 12, 2023, drawing around 300 people. Participants carried flowers, wore white shirts, and called for justice. Kévin's father, Guy Trompat, stood at the center of that public moment, asking that justice be done. The march showed the scale of feeling around the case. Leslie and Kévin had entered national news through fear and uncertainty. Now the community was trying to reclaim them through ritual, through gathering, and through the simple insistence that they were more than victims, found in separate rural locations. Even here, however, the grief was not fully united. Key News reported that Leslie's family did not associate itself with that march, and her stepmother had said so publicly. That detail matters, not because it reduces the sincerity of the event, but because it reminds us that bereavement does not follow one script. 2 families can be struck by the same crime and still choose different public forms of mourning, different timing, and different proximity to media attention. One family may want a visible collective tribute. Another may pull back, protect its own space, or reject an event it did not shape. In true crime, audiences often want a single emotional line. Real grief rarely gives them one. The funerals carried that same weight of finality. News reported that Kévin's funeral took place on March 16, 2023 at Saint-Hilaire Church in Niort, while Leslie's funeral was scheduled for 18 March in La Rochelle. Those dates matter because funerals are often the moment when a criminal case stops feeling like breaking news and becomes irreversible family history. Before burial or cremation, people can still speak the language of waiting, searching, and one last hope. After that, the language changes. The dead are being placed somewhere. The future is being reorganized around absence. The case may continue in court files for years, but the family calendar has already been divided into before and after. Public statements from those days show the depth of that rupture. During the Niort March, Guy Trompat said that justice must be done, and accounts from AFP coverage quoted him speaking in terms of a life destroyed by what had happened to his son. That kind of statement is more than grief language. It is the beginning of a moral demand. Families in homicide cases do not only mourn, they begin measuring the distance between what they have lost and what the legal system may or may not be able to deliver. In the Leslie and Kévin case, that tension was visible early. Even before any trial, the families were already confronting the gap between certainty of loss and the slower, less satisfying pace of proof. The public shock around the case came partly from the victims' ages and partly from the structure of the alleged crime. Leslie was 22. Kévin was 21. They were young, recently together, moving through ordinary local life and tied to family members who had fought publicly to keep the case alive. By the time the bodies were found and the prosecutor had confirmed death by blunt force blows, France was no longer dealing with a remote homicide involving strangers. It was dealing with a double killing rooted in a known circle, with a place to sleep at the center of the story and a handful of familiar names close to the emerging charges. That combination intensified public feeling because it made the crime feel less distant, less abstract, and much closer to everyday trust. This chapter matters because grief, in this case, did not stay still. It moved. It took different shapes in different hands. For some people, it became flowers, shirts, public gatherings, and funeral processions. For others, it became silence, private mourning, or refusal to participate in certain forms of tribute. For Kévin's father, it moved towards something even more destructive, a search not only for justice, but for retaliation. That later development is one of the hardest parts of the entire affair, because it shows how murder can continue damaging the living long after the bodies are found. On May 3rd, 2023, TF1 reported that Guy Trompat had been placed in police custody in a parallel matter related to a suspected revenge project. According to the report, prosecutors were examining allegations that he had tried to recruit detainees to eliminate those suspected in the murders of his son and Leslie, reportedly offering a large sum of money. The very existence of that allegation revealed how badly the grief had curdled. The man who had publicly called for justice at a march in March was, by May, himself under suspicion of trying to arrange violent payback. That does not erase his loss. It shows what loss can do when rage begins to outrun law. The judicial response was swift. TF1 reported on May 4th, 2023, that Guy Trompat appeared before the correctional court in Niort on allegations of instigation to assassination not followed by effect and death threats, and that he was placed in pre-trial detention, pending judgment on the merits. 1 month later, on June 2nd, 2023, TF1 reported that he was convicted of death threats and sentenced to 18 months in prison, 6 of them suspended, while being acquitted of the more serious count of instigation to assassination not followed by effect. Those details are crucial because they draw a careful legal line. The court did not uphold the most extreme accusation as charged, but it did find that his conduct crossed into criminal threats. Grief remained. It also became an offense. This is one of the deepest moral warnings in the whole story. A murder case can produce 2 different battles at once. The first is the fight to prove who killed the victims. The second is the fight to keep the grief of survivors from becoming another engine of destruction. In the public aftermath of Leslie and Kévin's deaths, both battles became visible. The state was already working to attribute the double homicide to the accused men. At the same time, it had to intervene when one of the bereaved appeared to move from mourning into threats. The violence at the center of the file had already taken 2 lives. It was now starting to deform the lives still around it. That second layer of damage is often ignored in simplified crime storytelling. Viewers are shown the victims, the suspects, the police, and the courtroom. What they are not always shown is what happens to the emotional temperature of the families. Loss can divide relatives from one another. It can create fights over publicity, marches, lawyers, and language. It can produce suspicion, fixation, sleeplessness, and a crushing need to do something when the legal system moves too slowly to satisfy the heart. In this case, public reporting gave clear signs of those pressures. Leslie's family standing apart from the march, Kévin's father demanding justice in public, and later his prosecution in a revenge-linked matter. Those are not side notes. They are part of what the murders did. The public also kept feeling the unresolved nature of the case. Even while mourning took visible form, motive remained blurred. News noted during the march coverage that the prosecutor had mentioned sentimental disappointment and/or financial debts, but that the precise motive remained unclear. That uncertainty matters because it deepened frustration. Families could bury Leslie and Kévin, yet still not know exactly why they had been targeted. The same true of the public. People could follow the arrests and body recoveries while still confronting a case that refused one neat explanation. Mourning becomes even harder when it cannot rest on an answer. There is also the lingering matter of Onyx, Leslie's dog, whose fate remained unknown in reporting tied to the White March. TF1's march coverage specifically noted that the march honored not only Leslie and Kévin, but also Onyx, whose disappearance had never been resolved. That detail seems small until you think about what it meant emotionally. For families, unresolved details can keep grief open. Even after bodies are identified and funerals held, one missing thread can continue pulling at the mind. What happened to the dog? Who last saw him? Was he abandoned, killed, taken elsewhere? The larger homicide case may dominate the headlines, but grief often fastens onto the smallest unanswered detail because it is one of the few places where the dead still seem close enough to protect. Another consequence of the public aftermath was exhaustion. Families in major criminal cases are forced to become mourners, witnesses, media figures, and informal guardians of the dead at the same time. Every microphone asks for memory. Every article revives the final night. Every procedural date threatens either hope or disappointment. That pressure could be seen around Leslie and Kévin from the earliest commemorations onward. One family stepping back from a march it did not wish to own. Another family taking a leading role in public tribute, both still trapped inside the same file and the same loss. Nothing about that arrangement is natural. It is what violent crime does to ordinary people. It drags them into public time before private grief has had room to breathe, and it forces love to coexist with evidence, lawyers, hearings, and headlines for even one quiet week after burial. If this case is making you think not only about crime, but also about what violence does to everyone left behind, press like and subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. The purpose here is not spectacle. It is to understand how one act of brutality keeps breaking lives long after the first headlines fade. Another important aftermath detail is the way the public memory of Leslie and Kévin remained tied to ordinary qualities rather than courtroom abstractions. In the March coverage, Kévin was remembered as someone who loved fishing, and an old boxing coach described him as disciplined and committed. Those small remembrances matter. They pull the victims back out of the procedural language of the case. Charges, custody, and court schedules can flatten the dead into file names. Rituals of mourning resist that flattening. They remind the public that Leslie and Kévin were not symbols created by the case. They were people whose habits, ambitions, and relationships existed long before anyone outside their families learned their names. By later stages of the case, the families were still being hit by procedural developments. TF1 reported in March 2025 that Nathan B., one of the accused, was released because of a procedural error involving the extension of his detention, and that the victims' families were outraged. That later reaction belongs in this chapter because it shows how the damage after death did not end in 2023. Every judicial development reopened the wound. A release is not an acquittal, but to grieving relatives it can feel like collapse, like the system forgetting what the graves already know. In that sense, the aftermath of Leslie and Kévin's deaths did not move in a straight line from sorrow to peace. It moved from shock to mourning to anger to renewed pain whenever procedure seemed to separate itself from moral certainty. The full circle moral revelation in this part is painful, but it is clear. The murders did not only involve Leslie and Kévin. They also tested every person who loved them. Public grief showed one response: gather, remember, insist on justice. Family division showed another: protect private pain. Step away from forms of mourning that do not feel right. Carry loss differently. The revenge case involving Guy Trompat showed the darkest response of all: let grief start imitating the violence that caused it. That does not make the living equivalent to the killers. It shows how murder tries to reproduce itself socially, pushing anger outward in search of another body, another prison sentence, another ruined life. That is the lesson worth carrying forward from Part 9. Justice and revenge are not the same thing, even when grief makes them feel close. Mourning and public tribute are not the same thing, even when both come from love. Family unity is not guaranteed, even when everyone has lost something unbearable. This case teaches that violent death creates secondary damage almost immediately. Conflicts over memory, conflicts over visibility, conflicts over what the dead would have wanted, conflicts over how much patience the law deserves. Leslie and Kévin's story, therefore, cannot be told honestly as only a homicide investigation. It must also be told as a study in what grief does under pressure. The community's reaction also shows something hopeful. Even in a case shaped by betrayal, discarded belongings, hidden bodies, and disputed motives, people still gathered in daylight to speak the victims' names with care. They still brought flowers. They still marked the river Kévin loved. They still arranged funerals, shirts, and processions. Those acts do not undo the crime. What they do is deny the killers the last word. Violence tried to reduce Leslie and Kévin to concealed bodies in rural ground. Public mourning answered by restoring them to relationship, memory, and place. Part 9 closes with the hardest truth of all. Some crimes do not end when the killers stop moving. They continue through court delays, family fracture, public rage, and the temptation to answer blood with blood. Leslie and Kévin's deaths produced all of that. Yet they also produced something else, a demand, repeated in marches, funerals, and court reporting, that the case be seen clearly and judged fully. That is where the story must go next. After grief, tribute, anger, and the damage that followed death, comes the final path through procedure, delay, court referral, and the unfinished question of what justice will finally look like in the name of Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat. After the bodies were found, after the autopsies narrowed the lie, after the families buried Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat and began living inside a grief no court can repair, the case entered its longest phase, procedure. This is where many true crime audiences grow impatient, because procedure does not move like panic, discovery, or arrest. It moves through orders, appeals, hearings, detention questions, legal deadlines, and arguments over what can still be challenged before a jury ever hears a word. Yet this final phase matters as much as any field search or custody interview, because justice does not only depend on what investigators believe happened, it depends on whether the system can carry that belief into a trial strong enough to survive attack. As of February 28, 2026, the public record shows that the Leslie and Kévin case has crossed a major threshold. 5 men have been sent to the assize court, and in December 2025, the Chamber of Investigation confirmed that referral after rejecting 2 appeals. But a final trial date was still not fixed in the public reporting I found, and some sources warned that further cassation steps could still push the hearing into 2027. That is the first hard truth of Part 10. A case can be morally obvious to the families long before it becomes procedurally ready for a full trial. By September 3, 2025, the investigating judge had issued an ordonnance de mise on accusation, sending 5 accused men before the Cour d'assises des Deux-Sèvres. According to News and Le Parisien, Tom Trouillet, Nathan B. and Michael Z. were referred for assassinations, Enzo C. for complicity in assassination, and Steven M. for modification of the crime scene and concealment of a corpse. Those charges reflect the same broad structure built through the earlier chapters of this story: alleged planning, alleged participation in the killings, alleged logistical support, and alleged post-crime concealment. What changed in September 2025 was not the moral shape of the case, but its legal posture. Suspicion had now been hardened into formal referral. For the families, that referral mattered because it was the first clear sign that the file had survived years of uncertainty and was strong enough, in the view of the investigating judge, to justify an assize trial. Leslie's family lawyer told News at the time that the civil parties could finally glimpse a trial, even while fearing that the accused, many of them under judicial supervision, would appeal. That fear was not paranoia. It was an accurate reading of how major criminal cases proceed. An investigating order does not end the fight. It invites the next one. That next fight arrived quickly. Two of the accused, Nathan B. and Enzo C., challenged their referral before the Chamber of Investigation of the Poitiers Court of Appeal. Accused reported on December 20th, 2025, that the hearing had already taken place on December 5th and that the court's ruling was expected on December 23rd. The article also explained why that date mattered so much. If the referral became definitive without further delay, a trial in autumn 2026 remained possible. If cassation review followed, the hearing could drift into 2027. The article also pointed to the legal rule that, once the referral becomes definitive, an accused held in pretrial detention must generally be tried within a year, subject to limited extensions. In other words, delay is not merely emotional in this case. Delay changes the practical pressure on custody, scheduling, and public confidence. On December 23rd, 2025, that appellate phase moved in the direction the families had hoped for. Hughes reported that the Chamber of Investigation declared the two appeals inadmissible and confirmed the referral of all 5 accused to the Assize Court. Leslie's family lawyer told the outlet that this confirmation made it possible to envision a trial during 2026 before the Du Sèvres Assize Court, while also warning that a cassation appeal by Nathan B. and Enzo C. could still postpone the case. The same report made 2 points that are essential for continuity here. First, the date of the trial was still not fixed at that stage. Second, only 2 of the 5 suspects remained in pretrial detention, including Tom Troilet. So the public record at the end of 2025 gave the case real forward motion without giving it finality. That distinction matters because Part 10 is not allowed to pretend certainty where the record still shows openness. The public path of this case now has a clear backbone. Leslie and Kévin disappeared on the night of November 25 to 26, 2022. Their bodies were found in March 2023. The investigation widened to 5 accused men. The prosecution theory, shaped further by the 2024 reconstruction, alleges a trap rooted in a familiar social circle. In September 2025, 5 men were sent to the Assize Court. In December 2025, appeals against that referral were rejected as inadmissible, but as of now, the trial itself has not yet produced a public verdict, and major coverage still described the hearing date as unresolved. That open ending is emotionally difficult, but it is also honest. Real justice does not always offer clean closure on the timetable grief wants. This case is a perfect example. Families have lived through the disappearance, the search, the body recoveries, the funerals, the motive debate, the revenge case involving Kevin's father, and the procedural shock of seeing one principal suspect released in March 2025 because of a procedural defect. News reported that release as the result of an error in the detention process. The point here is not to relitigate that decision. The point is to recognize what it does to trust. Families experience such developments not as technical adjustments, but as fresh injuries. They hear procedures where they expected protection. They hear deadlines where they expected certainty. They hear rights for the accused while still waking up every day to graves. This is where the story turns toward its deepest lesson. Cases like this are not only about the violence committed against the dead. They are about whether a legal system can remain patient, exact, and fair, even when the emotional demand for punishment is overwhelming. That patience can feel cruel from the outside. It can look like delay for delay's sake, but an assize trial is where the state must prove not only that Leslie and Kévin were murdered, but who among the accused planned, who struck, who transported, who watched, and who helped the truth stay buried. In a file involving multiple defendants and overlapping roles, every procedural step becomes a shield against future collapse. A rushed case can fail in a way that ruins the possibility of justice altogether. A careful case can feel slow, while still being the only responsible path. The legal language also reveals something about the gravity of the file. 3 accused were referred for assassinations, not simply for a lesser homicide characterization. One was referred for complicity in assassination, and another for crimes tied to modifying the scene and concealing a corpse. That charging pattern tells us the judicial system sees the alleged crime as layered and deliberate. It is not just the story of 2 young adults who ended up dead after a dispute. It is the story of an alleged trap, a killing, movement after death, and a distributed pattern of responsibility. In that sense, the legal posture of the file mirrors the moral structure developed across the earlier chapters. Trust misused first, violence delivered second, concealment managed third. Have you ever noticed how people say they want justice, but what they often want is speed? Put this in the comments. If a slower trial increased the chance of a stronger verdict, would you accept the wait, or would the delay itself feel like another failure? That question matters, because delay is not neutral. It has consequences. It changes detention status. It strains relatives. It keeps public memory in a state of suspense. It gives accused persons more time to challenge, reposition, and sometimes outlast attention. News noted in December 2025 that a cassation appeal could push the hearing into 2027. The same outlet also pointed to the legal time limits connected to definitive referral and detention. So the court path in this case is not merely symbolic. It is tied to a practical race between legal safeguards, defense strategies, and the family's fear that time itself may work in favor of the accused. There is also another layer to the final stage of this story: memory. A long case asks a lot from the public. It asks people to hold 2 truths at once. The first is that Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat were not abstractions. They were young people with recent plans, family ties, and a relationship barely underway. The second is that the legal process cannot simply honor their memory by emotion alone. It has to organize facts into proof that can survive defense attacks. When trials are delayed, the first truth grows more fragile in public discussion. People start remembering the procedural turns more than the victims themselves. That is why parts 9 and 10 belong together. Public mourning restored Leslie and Kévin as human beings. The court path must now carry those human beings through a system that speaks mostly in charges, orders, and appeals. This is also where the full circle moral revelation becomes clear. At the beginning of the story, everything depended on ordinary trust. Place to sleep, familiar people, a route that did not feel dangerous. The alleged trap worked because the victims walked into a plan that looked normal. At the end of the story, everything depends on a different kind of trust. Trust that institutions can do, slowly and lawfully, what private rage cannot. The families have already seen what happens when ordinary trust is abused. Part 10 asks whether civic trust can survive the long wait for judgment. That is the deepest circle in the entire case. Private trust failed Leslie and Kévin. Public trust is now being tested in their name. The final landing of this case cannot be a fake courtroom ending because the record does not support one yet. There is no public verdict I can honestly report as of today. What I can say is this: the file has advanced far enough that the state has formally committed to trying 5 men before the assize court, and the appeals examined in December 2025 did not derail that path. The trial remains ahead, not behind. The question now is no longer whether the justice system sees this as a double homicide with collective responsibility. Does. The question is whether the eventual trial will deliver a version of the truth strong enough to answer the families, the public, and the dead. That answer matters beyond this one case. Leslie and Kévin's story teaches that the most dangerous threats are often the ones that arrive through ordinary-looking arrangements. It also teaches that the aftermath of violence does not sort itself automatically into peace. Families can fracture, revenge can tempt, procedure can be exhausting, public attention can drift. Yet another lesson rises above all of that. Hidden violence depends on confusion, but justice depends on persistence, not noise, not a rumor. Persistence. Families showed it when they refused to accept voluntary disappearance. Investigators showed it when they followed phones, places, and contradictions until the bodies were found. The courts are being asked to show it now, across appeals, scheduling fights, and the slow discipline required to bring 5 accused men to trial. If you have stayed with this case from the first silence to this unresolved courtroom threshold, like the video, subscribe to Bedtime Black Files Stories, and tell me your view in the comments. Does justice mean speed, certainty, or the willingness to keep going until the truth can no longer be pushed aside? There is one more lesson worth carrying into the dark with you tonight. People often think the opposite of murder is life. In cases like this, that is too simple. The opposite of murder is also witness. It is the refusal to let the victims be reduced to a file number, a legal delay, or a procedural inconvenience. Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat disappeared into a night that should have ended in sleep. They were found months later in the earth, separated, hidden, and unable to speak for themselves. Everything that followed, from marches to funerals to referrals to appeals, has really been an argument over whether the living will speak clearly enough for them. So far, that argument is still ongoing. But the important thing is this: they were hidden, not erased. They were delayed, not forgotten. And until the assize court finally sits to hear what was done in Prahecq, and after Prahecq, the case remains a test of whether truth can outlast fear, time, and the damage done by people who believed familiarity would protect them. Cases like this also leave one final practical warning for ordinary people living far from any courtroom. Pay attention when a social plan depends too heavily on one person's space, one person's transport, one person's version of events, or one person's promise that everything is under control. Pay attention when friendship, money, desire, and secrecy start sharing the same room. Pay attention when a person around you seems to manage information more carefully than concern. The law may need years to name what happened, but private caution works earlier than any verdict. That is why stories like Leslie and Kévin matter even before the assize judges speak. They teach that safety is not only about avoiding strangers. It is about noticing when familiarity becomes leverage. It is about understanding that the person offering shelter, access, or a convenient plan may also be the person arranging the risk. Some lessons come too late for the dead. They do not have to come too late for the living. That is the smallest mercy any true story can still offer. That is where this script must end, because anything cleaner would be false. Leslie and Kévin's story does not close with a verdict yet. It closes with a waiting courtroom, grieving families, a file heavy with accusation, and a country still watching to see whether the law can finally say in full and in public what the evidence has been building toward for years. The first chapter began with silence. The last chapter ends with a different kind of silence. The silence before judgment. One was the silence of disappearance. This one is the silence of a court not yet opened. Between those two silences lies the entire lesson of the case. Trust carelessly given can destroy a life, but truth carefully pursued can still bring the hidden back into the light. Leslie Hoorelbeke and Kévin Trompat walked into a night that should have ended in rest. Instead, it became a case France still cannot forget. And maybe that is the hardest truth of all. Danger does not always arrive wearing the face of a stranger. Sometimes it waits inside a plan that already feels safe. So tell me in the comments, what do you believe failed first in this case? Trust, loyalty, or conscience? If you believe real stories should be told with care, clarity, and meaning, like this video, share it with someone who values truth, and subscribe to Bedtime Black File Stories. Because silence can hide a crime for a while, but it should never bury the people who were lost to it.